Welcome to the meeting number 7 of the Special Joint Committee on the Declaration of Emergency, created pursuant to the order of the House of March 2nd, 2022, and the Senate on March 3rd, 2022. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. I'd like to remind all those present in the room to please follow recommendations from the public health authorities as well as directors of the Board of Internal Economy to maintain safety and health. Should any technical challenges arise, please advise me, as we may need to suspend for a few minutes to ensure all members are able to participate fully. Witnesses should also be aware that translation is available through the global icon at the bottom of your screen. Is it agreed to repeat the 5-minute rounds as we did last week? I believe we have an agreement on that. Today we have representatives from the RCMP and CSIS. We are happy to welcome Commissioner Brenda Lucki of the RCMP. She is joined by Michael Duheme, Deputy Commissioner Federal Policing, and Brennan, Deputy Commissioner Contract and Indigenous Policing. We are also happy to welcome David Vigneault, Director of CSIS, and he is joined by Cherie Henderson, Assistant Director Requirements, and Marie-Hélène Chayer, Executive Director, Integrated Terrorism Assessment Center. We will start with Commissioner Lucki for opening remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening. Bonsoir tout le monde. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. As the Chair mentioned, I'm here with my colleagues, Deputy Commissioner Brennan and Deputy Commissioner Mike Duheme. Really, the primary goal of law enforcement is always to maintain public order and keep citizens safe. And as we all witnessed, police services across the country responded to unprecedented and highly disruptive demonstrations, illegal blockades, and occupations. In RCMP jurisdiction, we successfully used a measured approach and existing legislation to resolve border blockades at Henderson in Manitoba, Coutts in Alberta, and the Pacific Highway crossing into British Columbia. And the RCMP, Ontario Provincial Police, and the Ottawa Police Service established both a National Capital Region Coordination Centre and an Integrated Command Centre to ensure continued collaboration, the exchange of information, and coordination of investigation and enforcement activities within our nation's capital. On February 14th, the Government of Canada provided law enforcement with additional tools. The measures enacted under the Emergencies Act provided all police officers across the country, not just the RCMP, with the ability to deal with blockades and unlawful public assemblies. The emergency measure regulations supplemented existing authorities and provided new instruments for law enforcement to address these illegal blockades. So let's look at some concrete examples. First, police were able to maintain a secure perimeter throughout the National Capital Region and refuse entry of individuals traveling to the illegal protest with the intent of participating. Second, supporting an illegal assembly was also prohibited, and police had the enforcement authority to arrest individuals who continue to supply fuel, food, and other materials to an area of an unlawful assembly. And third, there were new powers to compel individuals to provide essential goods and/or services for the removal, towing, and storage of vehicles and equipment. I delegated these powers to the OPP, who used them to secure needed equipment to clear the streets of Ottawa. The goal was to bring a safe and swift end to the illegal blockade. I believe that we all effectively achieved this objective, and I want to thank all the police officers from all law enforcement agencies who joined this operation. I would like to now turn to the Emergency Economic Measures Order. J'aimerais maintenant traiter du décret sur les mesures.
I'd now like to deal with the Emergency Economic Measures Order.
That the Freedom Convoy was well funded with financial support provided to organizers through a variety of means, including crowdfunding platforms using both cryptocurrency and money. Once implemented, these orders allowed the RCMP and its partners to work even more closely with Canadian financial institutions in real time. And the RCMP developed a streamlined process where we acted as the central point of contact to disclose information to financial institutions on behalf of provincial, municipal, and federal law enforcement. Once established, the RCMP provided the relevant information to financial institutions, who then had the onus to determine which financial products could and should be frozen. This only included information on owners and operators of vehicles that were active participants in the in the blockades in Ottawa or convoy organizers. To be clear, because I know this has been raised in a number of different fora, at no time did the RCMP disclose any information on individuals who solely donated to the convoys or purchased related merchandise. In addition, the RCMP ensured financial institutions were updated regularly when owners and operators of the vehicles left the protest area. This allowed the financial institutions to really better assess and inform their own decisions about when to freeze or unfreeze accounts. After the situation was resolved, the Emergency Act was revoked. Une fois la situation résolue, le gouvernement.
Once the situation was resolved, the Emergency Act was revoked.
February 23rd, 2022, RCMP action culminated in the freezing of 257 financial products, which included bank, corporate accounts, and credit cards, the disclosure of 57 entities to financial institutions, which included individuals and owners of drivers of vehicles involved in the blockade, and identifying 170 Bitcoin wallet addresses that were shared with the virtual asset service providers. In closing, I really believe the Act provided us with the tools to resolve the crisis swiftly and peacefully, and I would like to thank you for the time and really the opportunity to speak more about this topic. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Commissioner. Can I ask you to raise your mic between your mouth and nose for the purpose of answering questions that will assist the interpreter somewhat as we move forward. We'll now move to the Director of CSIS, Mr. Vigneault. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, good evening. My name is David Vigneault, and I am the Director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. I am accompanied this evening by Cherie Henderson, Assistant Director for Requirements at CSIS, and Marie-Hélène Chayer, the Executive Director of the Integrated Terrorism Assessment Center. Je tiens à vous remercier pour l'invitation.
I wish to thank you for this invitation to discuss this act, and I would be very pleased to discuss this very important subject with you.
Is that CSIS is at all times dedicated to working closely with communities and our partners across the country to keep Canada and all Canadians safe. As this committee is well aware, CSIS has the mandate to investigate threats to the security of Canada, advise the government on these threats, and when appropriate, take steps to reduce them. Les menaces envers la sécurité du Canada.
Threats to Canada's security are defined under Section 2 under the CSIS Act. It includes espionage, sabotage, activities influenced from abroad that are of a clandestine or fraudulent nature or threatening, extremism, terrorism, and subversion.
Specifically prohibited from investigating lawful advocacy, protest, or dissent, except when it is carried out in conjunction with activities that constitute a threat to the security of Canada. In the case of the Freedom Convoy, CSIS was concerned by the threat of ideologically motivated violent extremism, or IMVE, and specifically the potential for serious acts of violence. As I recently said publicly, IMVE currently represents a significant national security threat. The combination of major disruptive events like the pandemic, the ever-increasing influence of social media, and the spread of conspiracy theories has created an environment ripe for exploitation by influencers and extremists. This environment has the potential to inspire individuals to commit acts of violence. The threat from IMVE is constantly evolving, fueled by extreme views around race, gender, power, and authority. IMVE is a threat that thrives on division and festers in the online space. But the hateful online rhetoric associated with these views is spilling over into the real world with the tragic consequences, including for equity-deserving communities across Canada. In the lead up to the Freedom Convoy, CSIS closely monitored known IMVE threat actors to assess any threat of serious acts of violence. This operational posture was informed by context. For one, CSIS has observed a rise in anti-authority violent rhetoric, particularly as it related to public health measures. CSIS was also aware of the opportunities that large gatherings and protests could offer IMVE actors to carry out acts of violence and recruit like-minded individuals. Finally, CSIS was concerned about the threat posed by lone actors. Throughout the events of January and February, CSIS remained engaged with the RCMP and other law enforcement partners to ensure the timely sharing of information. As you know, the definition of the Public Order Emergency and the Emergencies Act refers to, quote, threat to the security of Canada as defined in the CSIS Act. In determining if a situation rises to the level of a public order emergency, the Governing Council can consider multiple sources of information, not just CSIS intelligence. Indeed, CSIS is but one among the various federal departments and agencies whose collective advice ultimately informed the decision by the Governing Council to invoke the Emergencies Act. Before I conclude, I would like to point out that some of the factors that will limit what I'll be able to speak publicly this evening. As I'm sure you'll appreciate, there are some things that I'm prevented from saying in public under the Security of Information Act. Furthermore, the intelligence and advice we provide to the government is classified in order to protect our sources and methods. I take the responsibility of protecting our employees, our sources, and our tradecraft very seriously. En conclusion, je tiens à assurer le...
In conclusion, I want to assure the committee that even if CSIS's work is often done in the shadows, it does respect its commitment to protect the security of the Canadian public. This commitment means interaction with the communities we are protecting and the cooperation with other organizations, civil society, academia, and the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to a round of questions, beginning with Mr. Motz. Mr. Motz?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, RCMP members and CSIS members for being here. Commissioner Lucki, on what date and time were you first informed the government would be invoking the Emergencies Act?
Thank you for that question. There was discussions prior to the February 14th. I would say probably the day of the 14th was when we were advised that they were going to invoke it.
So that was your first time you had any conversation about the Emergencies Act, was February 14th?
No.
So my question is, when were you first informed that the government would be invoking the Act?
Oh, sorry, I thought you said when they did invoke the Act. We spoke about it. I don't have the exact date in front of me, but I would say approximately within the week before there was discussions of various, when I was giving situational reports, there was discussions of various talks about the Emergency Act.
Within the week then, and who informed you?
I think I can't say for sure. It may have been within a deputy minister committee.
Okay. So in your opening remarks, you indicated that various border crossings, including Emerson and Coots, were resolved using existing legislation. Now, my question then is, do you really believe the government's invocation of the Emergencies Act in response to the Freedom Convoy was a national emergency that was necessary, legal, and met the threshold? Yes or no? And it couldn't be resolved with any other existing law in country? Yes or no?
Well, you referred to how we resolved them within RCMP jurisdiction. We obviously had the benefit of hindsight of what happened in Ottawa. And there was times when we actually would have used it had it been invoked earlier.
Resolve the other matters without the use of the Emergencies Act with existing legislation. So my question again is yes or no, do you believe the Emergencies Act was necessary and that it met the threshold and it was a national emergency and it was legal and it met the requirements and could not be dealt with under any existing law? Yes or no?
Well, it's not for me to answer whether we met the threshold.
Well,
That's
your
for the
opinion
government
matters.
to
Your Commissioner,
I can
your
tell you how
opinion
we
does
used
matter.
it.
I know how you used it.
I could tell you how we used it.
We know how you used it. Thank you. Given the fact that the convoy protests paled, the Freedom Convoy protests paled in comparison to the crowdsource-funded, pre-planned violent attack at Coastal GasLink site, did the RCMP make use of the Emergencies Act provisions in response to that incident? Yes or no?
No.
Did the RCMP seek advice from anyone or request to use the the Emergencies Act in the Coastal GasLink site attack? Or were you told that it was too political and that it would interfere with the government's actions? Are you sure?
No, we're not interfered with by the government. That was a
my question though is, did you ask anyone, even your own legal department, for advice on whether you should be invoking the Emergencies Act at Coastal GasLink, which was a violent attack, millions and millions of dollars in damage, booby traps set for not only officers, people were threatened with axes. It was a violent attack, and it was crowdfunded. We know this. So did you or did you not seek it? Did your organization seek it, advice, or request it?
Well, with regard to any advice that I got from my legal department, that would be solicitor-client privilege.
And you can revoke that if you're the client. You can revoke that if you wish. So my question just is: did you ask for advice? I'm not asking for the advice. I'm asking if you did seek advice.
No.
Okay. Just so you are aware, you may not be aware, and in fairness to you, you may not be aware, but I do know that your organization did seek legal advice on that, just so that you were aware. Commissioner, did you offer any advice to the Minister of Public Safety or any government ministry or minister respecting the Emergencies Act?
I can't speak specifically to any advice that was done in Cabinet. But what I can say is that each and every day during the convoy, I provided situational report.
Okay, would you undertake to provide that situational reports to this committee?
Anything that we had in paper was given to PCO, and they are the keepers and the distributors of all the information regarding this event.
Okay, so yes or no? Section 5 of the RCMP, pardon me?
I'm sorry, I was waving. You couldn't see
I'm
me
sorry.
to tell you your 5 minutes is up.
We need an alarm, I think.
Just look this way, we'll get you. Next, we'll go to Madame Badayan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To the witnesses, thank you for being here. I'll start off with a very recent and concerning example of what members of the Conservative opposition have been saying. The member for Carleton, Pierre Poilievre, has recently indicated that the RCMP was taking orders from the Prime Minister's office, from ministers' offices, and at a recent leadership event, Mr. Poilievre stated that he believed that what he saw was that the Trudeau government, and I quote, was seizing the bank accounts of political enemies, end quote. I wonder if you could comment on that, because at last week's meeting, we had the pleasure of welcoming witnesses from FinTrack, the Department of Finance, all of whom testified on the record that the government was in no way involved in the freezing of bank accounts directly, that this was the RCMP working to provide information to the banks where necessary. And I'm hoping you can clarify what the RCMP's role was in that, and also clarify to the best of your ability what the government's involvement, if any, was in the freezing of bank accounts.
Thank you for that. We weren't involved in the actual freezing of any bank accounts. I will pass it to my colleague from Federal Policing, but what I can say is that what we did was we gathered the information from the various police agencies because we have previous relationships with the various banks, and we facilitated providing information to the banks, and it was their decision as to whether they would freeze it or not. But going to your first question, at no time were we directed by the government.
Thank you. I am going to turn to the situation at the borders, which has been of grave concern to me ever since these illegal blockades. It is my understanding that the blockades at the border, it's at Emerson, Surrey, Coutts, and elsewhere were not cleared until after the invocation of the Emergencies Act. You're free to comment on that if you will, but. Also, from an economic perspective, we are talking about the border crossings that are responsible for literally billions of dollars worth of trade going back and forth between the United States and Canada. To my knowledge, no, in the history of our country, no such blockades have ever existed. Again, you're free to comment on that. But my question to you is, do you feel that the deterrent effect of having invoked the Emergencies Act was useful? Because I'm looking at a statement from RCMP Sergeant Paul Manegre, who indicated that in his dealings with people at the blockades blocking our international trade corridors, that it was indeed very useful for it to encourage people who were blocking our borders to leave voluntarily. Would you agree that the Emergencies Act had that effect?
Yeah, I would agree with what Paul Maneg said, in the sense that there was, when we have protests, it's all about reducing the amount of people there so that if we ever did have to enforce, it would be safe. So we often, we heard from people saying, I'm leaving because I don't want my account to get frozen, or I'm leaving because I don't want my truck to be towed. So we had actual people saying that in both the Ottawa situation and across various other protest areas.
And just to be perfectly clear, they were not saying that prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
No, many of them, especially I can say in the Ottawa context, what we did was we tried to reduce the footprint by, in conversation through liaison teams, police liaison teams, to try to reduce the footprint and to get people to be motivated to leave. And of course, there are people that left after the weekends, but again, a lot of people would show up in the week. And so there was a group that never left the entire time, and it was authorities within the Emergency Act that served as a motivator and a deterrent for people to come back in.
Thank you. I'm going to touch very briefly on the topic of children, children being involved in these illegal activities. I understand, again, that the RCMP has commented on the fact that the Emergencies Act provided additional authorities to you and to security in order to ensure the safety of children.
Yeah, the Emergency Act had a authority to prevent children from being brought into the situation. And of course, if we were ever going to go towards enforcement action and children, it just doesn't go well together. And
I'm sorry to cut you off, but Madame Badayan's time is up. We'll now move to Monsieur Fortin.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Lucki and Mr. Vigneault. My question is for you, Ms. Lucki. I understand from your testimony up until now that about a week before February 14th, you had discussions concerning the future declaration of emergency powers. With whom did you have those discussions? What was discussed exactly? Who was there? What was indicated as being things that could trigger the declaration of an emergency situation?
Thank you for that question. First, most of any of the discussions that we had were within the deputy minister community. So of course there was representatives from customs, transport, public safety, trying to think who else, anybody who had sort of had parts of the situation, and I think it was PCO and Justice. And so we would discuss.
Est-ce qu'il y avait quelqu'un du bureau du Premier?
Was there anyone from the Prime Minister's office in those discussions?
Discussions, no.
Et qu'est-ce qui était invoqué comme?
What was invoked as being an incident or an element that could trigger the emergency measures? What were you told?
I have no idea what would trigger it. All I know is that I provided on-site advice from the situational awareness for the decision makers on what was happening on the ground in all police jurisdictions from coast to coast to coast.
Well, I'd like you to tell me how many situations, coast to coast to coast, were considered out of control and requiring a proclamation of an emergency situation. How many situations like that were there?
What I can say is obviously we had the Ottawa protests that were very long and taking, and the occupation of the downtown. The protest at the Windsor border was, of course, concerning. Both in the RCMP jurisdiction, for example, in Emerson and Coutts, we had ways of diverting traffic. So although they couldn't get through that primary border crossing, we had alternate routes.
Okay.
And,
Madame Lucki.
Ms. Lucki, I'm sorry, I don't want to be impolite, but we really don't have much time. Would it be possible for you to send me a document where you would list each of the places where, in your opinion, there was a situation that required the declaration of an emergency situation, and tell me exactly what was that situation? For instance, blocking a bridge in Windsor. Just give me a list of each place and what the situation was. Would it be possible for you to do that?
Well, I would, again, we've put in all of our documents for release.
Mais est-ce que vous pouvez me faire?
Could you do that for me, Ms. Lucki? Because time is of the essence. Could you provide me with such a list?
I'm not sure. I would definitely have to check with the people who I've disclosed the information to.
Mais c'est un peu une partie.
Well, that's part of your testimony. You're saying, you told me that you took part in a meeting about a week before February 14th where you discussed situations with various people, situations coast to coast to coast. That's what you just said. Now you're telling me you don't know. If you discussed it, you must know. I want to know, what were those situations? I know that on Wellington it lasted for weeks. We know that. But the other places, I'd like to know what places and what situations had become unmanageable. That's part of your testimony. I'm asking you to summarize it in a document rather than listing it. So I'm counting on your cooperation, Ms. Lucki. Can I count on your cooperation?
What I can do to provide,
C'est pas
like I
très
said, we
compliqué,
provide a
là.
regular.
Well, it's not that complicated. I'm asking you to write down what you said. You said during the meeting there are emergency situations in the field. Who took the notes that you wrote that you told us in the introduction, Ms. Lucki?
I can only speak to what happened in RCMP jurisdictions from an RCMP
Non, mais
perspective.
demandez donc à votre.
Why don't you ask your boss to come and testify? I'd like to hear your boss. If you're not in a position to answer, perhaps we could question your boss for him to answer, but I need that information. I wasted my 5 minutes asking you for a list of places where there were problems, and that's too bad because I have many other questions to ask you. I'd like to see some cooperation from the RCMP, Ms. Lucki. That's not anything complicated. Seems to me that's the least we could ask. I'm just asking for a list of the places. Thank you, Mr. Fortin.
Go ahead.
Yeah, if something is being requested of a presenter and they decide to make it available, is it made and shared amongst all the committee members?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Green?
Thank
You
you.
have 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I just want to begin by noting the frustration of my colleague around the table and state that while we have witnesses present, it is by no means personal or directed to individuals, but I think in some of the institutional frustrations. So I'd like to begin with Mr. Vigneault from CSIS. Mr. Vigneault, sir, are you familiar with the duty of candor under the CSIS Act?
Yes, I am familiar with that.
And would you agree with the statement that the House of Commons and the courts are coordinate authorities?
I'm not sure what you refer to by coordinate authorities.
I mean that the terms of reference of this particular committee would require you to have a duty of candor, given that the House of Commons and the Senate are coordinate authorities to the courts, as through common law.
What I can say is that, I will, to the best of my ability, in the limits of the CSIS Act and the Security of Information Act, Mr. Green, I will absolutely endeavor to be as candid as possible with you and all committee members.
So the information will be presented completely accurately, fairly, and fully?
Absolutely.
And you will agree to be frank within these discussions?
I am always frank in my discussions with members of Parliament.
Commissioner Lucki, you've heard the statements that the questions that I've asked Mr. Vigneault, and given that context, I would ask you the same, and I would actually go further and let you all know that in the beginning in the contemplation of this committee, we contemplated having you all swear an oath And I feel like the seriousness of this committee is undermined when we don't get the frankness and the concise and full information that we deserve. So having heard that, Commissioner Lucki, do you also agree to the duty of candor?
I'm fully committed to the
Okay.
duty of candor.
Mr. Vigneault, you made a comment that you were prevented to make statements in public, sir. If you are familiar with the terms of reference of this committee, you will know that this committee has been sworn to be provided with information that is sensitive given the seriousness of the invocation of this act. So given that's the case and given you've agreed to the duty of candor that you have, if you ever feel like you can't say something in public, would it be your wish then that we would invite you back in camera to get to the fullness of the answers?
I'm absolutely at whatever the committee decides to do. Of course, I will try to comply to the best of my ability and to answer all the questions with candor. There are limitations on what I can say publicly in terms of classified information. And
We've been sworn in, sir. So I'll go to my first question, which is that under Section 2, subsection D of the CSIS Act, it identifies the following as threats to the security of Canada: activities directed towards undermining by covert unlawful acts or directed towards or intended ultimately to lead to the destruction or overthrow by violence of the constitutionally established system of the Government of Canada. Convoy organizers released a memorandum of understanding stating that their goal of overthrowing Canada's democratically elected government. In this context, how did CSIS assess the threat to security of Canada in relation to Section 2, subsection D of the CSIS Act?
So this is one of the area that is of a very complex nature. The element related to subversion has to be assessed extremely carefully. CSIS in the past, and I would refer you to some of our public annual report that have been tabled in parliaments, CSIS has not investigated the acts of subversion in recent years. What we are seeing now is with the rise of the threat posed by ideologically motivated
Question with specificity. Mr. Vigneault, I asked a question with specificity, and it was...
I'm trying to answer, Mr. Green.
Well, listen, respectfully, we have 5 minutes in these rounds, and having you dance around the question when I ask a specific question, in my opinion, is not you being frank, sir. And I'm asking a question that is germane to the invocation of the declaration with high specificity. So I'm requesting you answer that question specifically. I'm not interested in what you've done in the past.
What I'm saying, Mr. Green, that I think it's important for the committee members to understand is that when we assess the threat of IMVE, we look at the acts of violence.
That's not what I asked.
Acts of subversion.
That's
Mr.
not
Green,
what I
please
asked.
Let me finish.
Okay, no, it's not about finishing, sir. It's about answering the question that's directed to you. The question is, how did CSIS assess the threat to security of Canada in relationship to Section 2D of the CSIS Act as it relates to the invocation? That's a direct question, sir.
Yes, and Mr. Green, I would answer to you that the advice, classified advice we provide to the government, I'm not at liberty to discuss.
So you're unwilling to answer the question for the purpose of this committee?
No,
is that what
I just answered the question, Mr. Green.
Mr. Green, can you take the chair? So
I most certainly can. Thank you, and I will reset the clock. And Senator, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My first question, first of all, welcome to our witnesses tonight. My first question is to the Director of CSIS, and I want to give you an opportunity to put in context what you find yourself dealing with today compared to what you would have dealt with, say, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. So we have a framework in which we can start to operate.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The issue of the threat environment has evolved significantly over the last 4 years. We have made public through our annual reports and through different, public comments, the fact that from a CSIS point of view, we are more worried about the rise of violent extremism in Canada. We have seen, unfortunately, people being killed in Canada by people espousing, extreme ideology. We have seen minorities being specifically targeted. We have seen, in Quebec City and in London, Ontario, people were killed just because they were Muslims. And so this is an area that we have seen with growing with concern in Canada, and we have devoted more and more resources of our investigative resources to try to address this threat, to try to take measures to counter it, also to advise government and Canadians to our public discourse and public releases about the nature of the threat.
Thank you very
So I
much.
think
And-
this is thank you.
Thank you, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but just with the context of this convoy, in your time as director and your balance of your career, have you ever seen an event like this that Canada has faced?
So what the concern we had with the convoy, the outset and throughout, was the fact that we have seen in Canada, in other jurisdictions, people using protest and demonstration, violent extremists using these protests and demonstration to engage in acts of violence, to recruit members, to be able to spread their ideology further. And so when we looked at the convoy coming over and, with our partners in the Integrated Terrorism Assessment Center, we looked at those elements. We looked at the targets that we were aware of at CSIS, the people were engaged in these violent activities, and see how they would try to use and manipulate those demonstrations. We're also concerned with the lone actors, people who would, be engaged in violence spontaneously. And this is what we were focusing our activities during the convoy and providing information to law enforcement and to the government.
Thank you very much. And my next question is for Commissioner Lucki. Welcome. With respect to my colleague, Mr. Motz, raised a question of various jurisdictions, I think, and where issues were different. In your context of other provinces, you would have been the police service of jurisdiction, with the exception of Ontario, where the Ottawa Police would have been the police service of jurisdiction. Am I correct?
Yes, and Quebec as well, and some of the municipalities within the provincial jurisdiction.
So, City of Windsor, for instance. So, can you?
All of Ontario. Yeah.
Can you explain in a place like Ontario versus Alberta, where you would have varying roles? Ontario, for instance, you have the provincial responsibility falls to the OPP. What is the role of the RCMP with respect to Ontario?
We have a federal mandate, and I can pass it to my colleague Mike Duheme, who's the federal policing, to explain that mandate.
Yes, Madam Chair, with regards to federal policing's mandate is to tackle serious and organized crime at the transnational level, the border between the ports of entry. We also have responsibility with regards to protective policing, where we protect the Prime Minister, the Governor General, the Chief Justice, and other incoming dignitaries. Cybercrime as well as financial crime.
Okay, Deputy, if I can, because our time is limited. With respect to Ontario and particularly Ottawa, your jurisdiction would be federal in nature in normal events. Am I correct?
That's correct, Madam Chair.
And so with respect to Windsor, you'd find yourself in the same place?
Same place for Windsor, although we did provide assistance to the OPP at Windsor Crossing.
In your federal capacity?
Yes.
And in Alberta, you would have all three levels, as we know in policing in Canada, municipal, federal, and provincial. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
That's correct. Thank you. Thank you. Senator Vigneault, you have 5 minutes.
Merci, ma question.
Thank you. My question is for the RCMP. Ms. Lucki. I'm on the Ottawa Police Service's website. On it, you see reports, daily reports about what the Ottawa Police was doing. We see that on February 6th, they issued 450 tickets. They arrested 7 people. On February 7th, they continued. And then on February 8th, 23 arrests, 1,300 tickets issued. So there were provisions in the legislation that did apply, be it the highway code or the criminal code, on the territory of Ottawa before February 14th.
Yes, there is municipal bylaws, there's provincial laws, and as well there is criminal code and various other statutes.
Okay. Et le 12 février.
And on February 12th, the Ottawa Police Service announced that they establish an integrated command center to coordinate law enforcement. We're not talking about the Emergencies Act, we're talking about law in general, because the Emergencies Act had not yet been enacted or applied or decreed. So they say that they will work in cooperation with the OPP and the RCMP in order to have this integrated command center, in order to counter the massive arrival of protesters in the Ottawa region and the intensification of the occupation, and to secure the area and make sure people leave. So this was February 12th. You don't need the Emergencies Act to do all that.
I'm not sure if there's a question there.
Oui, il y a une question.
Yes, there's a question. So you did not need the Emergencies Act to establish an integrated command center to enforce the law with the Ottawa Police Service and the OPP.
The integrated command center was established so that the OPP and the OPS and the RCMP created a planning cell in order to create a plan for enforcement action.
Vous aviez les pouvoirs.
So you had the power to arrest, you had the power to lay criminal charges for disturbing the peace, misdemeanors. You had the power to arrest people even without a warrant at that point.
This was completely a different type of protest where people were not leaving, and our police liaison teams were trying to motivate people to leave, because when we're dealing with a mass protest, it's all about reducing that footprint so that we can be as safe as we can with enforcement action. When the weekend was full of protesters was not the time to do any type of enforcement, because it's too dangerous for the public, it's too dangerous for police. So we always try to reduce the footprint by deterring people to come in and motivating people to leave. And obviously there was a great group of people.
But on February 12th, when you established this plan to coordinate emergency measures or law enforcement measures, there was no question at that point of adopting the Emergencies Act. You didn't know at that point that the Emergencies Act would be invoked.
No, I did not. But what I can say is that the Emergency Act did give us the tools that we needed to get the job done quickly.
Mais à quel moment?
At what point did you find out that there would be an invocation of the Emergencies Act?
Invoked.
Okay.
There was lots of talk about it, but...
Donc, tout le monde...
So, throughout the time before that, you had prepared with the Ottawa Police Service and the OPP an intervention plan to free up the streets, to clear the streets.
Yeah, we started a plan in and around a planning cell to do the planning in and around February 12th was when the cell got together to start planning for enforcement activity in the downtown core.
Okay.
For second round. Senator Harder.
Chair, and thank you, Commissioner and Director, for your appearance tonight. I'm going to start with Commissioner Lucki and go forward from the questions of my colleague, Senator Carignan. In developing the plan, which was before the invocation, were you assuming the invocation of the emergency measures in your plan?
Not at all.
That's interesting. So do you view the invocation of the Emergency Measures Act as a failure of policing?
No, not at all.
Would you not agree with, at least my observation, that the events, particularly in Ottawa, were unmanageable from an Ottawa Police Force point of view, from an OPP point of view, and from a RCMP point of view, up until the emergency measures were invoked? That, in my book, is a failure.
This was a very, very unique and fluid situation in Ottawa. It was a lot different than what we had seen across the country. And it increased exponentially every weekend. And then sometimes the numbers would go down, but there were core groups that refused to leave.
But if it's not a failure of policing, why would you urge the invocation of the Emergency Act? It's an extraordinary act to be declared.
We were not, and it wasn't really the police that were not in the position to, provide influence on the government as to when and where they invoke a certain act. For us, it was about keeping Canadians safe in Ottawa, and when they did bring in the act, it definitely provided us some authorities that helped reduce the footprint so we could do a safer enforcement.
Did you or your ICC, the Integrated Command Center, see the need for invocation of the Act before the Act was invoked?
Well, I can tell you from an RCMP perspective, for example, we were in the midst of trying to enforce at Coots, for example, and we could not enforce because we couldn't access any tow trucks. And so we weren't able to do the enforcement that we needed on the days that we wanted to enforce because we had no authorities to force the tow truck drivers to assist, and all of them refused to provide the service. Sorry?
Would that not be a failure of policing?
We don't own tow trucks. So if, in fact, we wanted to move the trucks from the area, we needed tow trucks to do part of our tow trucks is a part of our equipment, but it's contracted out. So
but
when
Commissioner, you use tow trucks in other protests without the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
Well, in Coots, we couldn't use tow trucks. They wouldn't come to our, we asked them to come to assist us, but they would not. So we looked to the military as well. And in the end, what ended up happening is the government of Alberta purchased some tow trucks, which was just at the onset of the invocation of the Emergency Act. But we were trying to enforce far before then. But in order to enforce, we had to remove both the people and the equipment, but we didn't have tow trucks to move the equipment.
My next question is for the director of CSIS. And I do respect the nature of the act and what you can and cannot tell us about. But I'd like you to comment a little more fully on the IMVE presence that you and your agency saw within the convoy and the Freedom Convoy in particular.
Thank you, Senator Arthur. So essentially, I would characterize the fact that we have seen a number of individuals were of concern to CSIS prior to the convoy, being engaged both online and also in person in the context of the convoy. We have seen activities taking place of people trying to recruit other individuals. We have seen activities that were characterized by an element of rhetoric. And so what we have done is be able to assess this information, share intelligence with and information with our law enforcement partners as part of a joint intelligence group, and also advise the government about the threat that we saw to the security of Canada. So
Thank
that's
you.
kind of, if you want, how we would characterize it. Sorry.
Senator Harder, you're finished. We'll catch it next round. Senator White.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for making themselves available. Commissioner Lucki, we've heard multiple times from ministers and others that the Emergency Act and the tools provided were specifically requested by police leadership. As a law enforcement agency with primacy for national security, did you ask the government or representatives for the invocation of the Emergencies Act?
No, there was never a question of requesting the Emergency Act. There was a question.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm sorry. So you never asked for it. Do you know of any other police leadership that asked specifically the government for the invocation?
No, we actually reached out to various police agencies when there was talk about some of the authorities within that they were proposing, and of course we were consulted because we were the ones who would be using those authorities, so we were consulted to see if they would be any use to police in the context of the Freedom Convoy.
Thank you, Commissioner. You mentioned earlier, and we've heard it repeated by others, about tow trucks as an example of something that was needed. One of the reasons or rationales for invocation was consideration given to use aid to civil power so that you could actually use military tow trucks or military vehicles to remove the vehicles from either Coutts or Ottawa?
Absolutely. We did many inquiries in regards to the use of the Canadian Armed Forces.
Did you apply for aid to civil power?
No, because when we did the inquiries directly with them, they told us they didn't have the equipment necessary to remove such equipment.
Do you have that in writing, Commissioner, if you don't mind? Do you have that in writing from them saying they do not have vehicles to tow trucks?
I'm not sure, but I know there was 2 vehicles in the Edmonton area, but that could possibly do what we were looking for, but we couldn't get access to it for several days, and that was the only place in Canada they told us that they had such equipment.
Thank you very much. Was the event that was occurring in downtown Ottawa and continuing considered a national security threat by yourself? You have no sound.
Commissioner, you're on mute.
Mute.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
When we look at the national security threat, we look at it in regards to criminal, and of course there's a number of organizations with a mandate in this area, such as CSIS, but although most of the people participating in Ottawa protests, they were motivated by a desire to end that COVID-related type of mandate, we assess some of the ideologically motivated extremists were probably present and attempting really to leverage the protest and its high profile for their own purposes.
But the Department of Justice website actually identifies the RCMP as the law enforcement agency responsible for national security in Canada. So did you consider it a national security threat? And if you did you express that to the Minister of Public Safety? And if so, was there any consideration for the RCMP taking over the event and the operation that was occurring in downtown Ottawa as a result of that threat?
No, because we aren't the police of jurisdiction, and if Ottawa Police Service needed additional resources, they were to go to the Ontario Provincial Police as per the Ontario Policing Act.
Well, I understand that, but I think, in my previous role, I used RCMP officers in the hundreds many times. In fact, I remember swearing them in the basement of our building. And I certainly didn't always go to the OPP, although the commissioner who's sitting at the front here, I'm sure, often gave me resources when they were asked. So I recognize that, but I also saw thousands of police officers from every agency in Canada operating well before the invocation of the Emergencies Act. So I can't imagine that you would not have offered resources to the Ottawa Police Service in their job in relation to the occupation.
Absolutely. Any request of resources that they had asked for, we fulfilled those requests.
Can you advise us whether or not you could have removed the occupation without the invocation of the Emergencies Act in Ottawa?
Well, what I can...
I don't want to hear what happened as a result, though, because I only have about 30 seconds. Could you have removed them without the invocation?
It's really not up to me to speak to hypotheticals or speculate on.
It wasn't hypothetical, it was real. You would have had a plan. Could you have removed that occupation without the Emergency Act? Because I'll go back to Senator Harder. If so, then if you could not have, then it was a failure of policing. And which might mean that you needed to invoke the act, right?
It's very speculative because we weren't the police of jurisdiction, so I don't have all the intimate details of what was known and what wasn't known.
But there was a joint command center prior to the invocation, right?
Yes, absolutely. But I can say we did actually successfully conclude protests across the country without the invocation of the Emergency Act, but it was a much different situation.
Thank you very much, Commissioner.
Thank you, Senator White. We'll now move to second round, and I believe we're going with Mr. Brock this time. Mr. Brock, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for your appearance today. So I have several questions, several themes, limited time. So I'm going to address an issue right up front to both Ms. Lucki and Mr. Vigneault. Hope I pronounced your name correctly, sir. I'm just learning French. But I want to know whether or not any of your witnesses, yourselves or your witnesses, your assistants with you, are prepared to answer any questions regarding whether the legal threshold of the invocation of the Act was met, and whether, in your belief, the issue or the Act itself was charter compliant, the measures taken under the Act were charter compliant. Is anyone prepared to answer those questions?
From the RCMP perspective, we're not in the position to speak about the legal threshold. That wasn't part of our responsibilities.
Okay. And that would apply to you. Go ahead.
Yes, Mr. Brock, and you did pronounce my name very well. Thank you. No, unfortunately, I would not be at liberty to provide any legal interpretation of this. Thank you.
Secondary to that question, both of your departments have a legal division. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Right. And I understand that legal division is under the auspices, under the leadership of the Department of Justice. Correct?
Yes.
Accurate.
So the legal advice that you opined on from my colleague, Mr. Green, and I'll get to some more specifics in a moment, did that come from your internal legal departments or did it come from the DOJ?
I don't know what advice you're referring to.
Any advice with respect to this Emergencies Act? Any legal advice as to whether the threshold was met and that the provisions were charter compliant? Canadians want to know that answer.
I wasn't part of the discussions of the legal threshold and if the legal threshold was met.
Well, who in your department received legal advice if it wasn't the commissioner?
No, that was done by the people who made the decision to invoke the Act. And
So
we did not make the decision to the...
Okay, so the information from Justice or the information from your legal department went to who at the RCMP? You or somebody else?
No, we have legal services, but we only discussed once the authorities were available what it meant for us to
Maybe I'm
enforce them.
confusing you, okay? My colleague, Mr. Green, asked you a question regarding some advice. You cited solicitor-client privilege, for which you are the client and you are entitled to waive. And I'll get to that in a moment. So my question is, who gave the RCMP legal advice regarding anything pertaining to the Emergencies Act before the invocation? Was it the Department of Justice or was it your internal legal department?
Well, my legal service is a part of the Department of Justice.
Okay, so it came from your internal department?
Which is part of Department of Justice.
Right, okay. See, I got 10 seconds left. And are you still maintaining solicitor and client privilege? Are you willing to waive that?
Well, I'm also bound by cabinet confidence as well.
You're not part of the cabinet. You're not part of that confidence.
No, but I am when I provide them information in cabinet.
To be continued. Oh, do I?
Seconds.
Oh.
Go ahead.
You're not part of cabinet. You're not an elected official. So why are you hiding behind cabinet confidentiality? Canadians
point of
want
order,
to
Madam
know.
Chair, I would just request that the questions go through the chair rather than directly to the witness.
I didn't think we were that formal, Madam Chair, that we had to
We
say
weren't
through the
before
chair.
the badgering, but now we are.
The question. We stopped the clock. Okay, we'll go ahead. It's 37 seconds.
Why do you feel you are bound by cabinet confidentiality as an unelected official?
When I'm providing information within cabinet, I'm bound by the rules of cabinet.
Are you part of the Liberal government, Ms. Lucki?
Not at all.
Are you a donor to the Liberal Party?
No,
You sure about that?
I'm sure.
Are you still citing cabinet confidentiality?
Yes.
Mr. Vigneault, are you going to cite that as well?
Madam Chair, if there's a question, a specific question, I'm happy to try to answer.
Mr. Brock, your time is up.
Thank you.
Mr. Nakvi, you're next.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Before I start my question, just want to confirm we have 5 minutes in this round.
Your mic wasn't on.
Yes, Mr. Nakvi, you do.
5 minutes, okay. I'm going to ask questions for 4 minutes, and I will share last minute of my time with Ms. May, if that's okay with Chair.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll go to Commissioner Lucki, and I'll build on the conversation that you were having, Commissioner, with the chair around police of jurisdiction. Can you describe to us, and I'm talking in case of Ottawa at this moment, what was the role of the RCMP prior to the Invocation of Emergencies Act in Ottawa when the protest/occupation was taking place?
Thank you for that question. In the first weekend, our role was part of our federal mandate, and that's the protection of parliamentarians, the Prime Minister. We work with the parliamentary precinct, and we protect the parliamentary precinct, which includes the Senate and the Parliament. And because we have other resources within the City of Ottawa, located within the City of Ottawa, we also provided frontline assistance to Ottawa Police Service as well as other specialized resources. But they are the police of jurisdiction, so we worked under their lead in that regard.
And for that to happen prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, your officers, RCMP officers, had to be sworn in by the Ottawa Police Service in order to perform those frontline duties?
The frontline duties, yes.
Okay. And can you tell us any other assistance you were providing to City of Ottawa in the earlier days of that occupation as requests were coming in?
Yeah, I'll pass that to Mike Duheme because he was leading that.
Thank you, Commissioner. Madam Chair, just to the question, early on the stage, we did have the National Capital Region Command Center stood up, which is comprised of OPS, OPP, other law enforcement from the Quebec side, and transport, ambulance technician, firemen, just a coordination hub to make sure that everybody's in tune of what's going on if an emergency is called regarding fire trucks, and it's more a coordination center for information that comes in before we go into the operational mode. That was stood up early, and that also uses as a hub for intelligence that's going on for the event.
Thanks, Mr. Duheme. I'm just going to ask you a very quick question and pass it on to Ms. May. I just want to make sure she's got her time. Is what changed? What are some of the key things changed for RCMP once the Emergencies Act was invoked in dealing and responding to the occupation that was taking place in Ottawa?
That's a great question. It's all about reducing the footprint so that we can enforce safely, so we could maintain and reinforce the perimeter. It provided us and other policing partners an ability to restrict travel, to prevent children from being brought into the situation, securing those necessary equipments like tow trucks, and ensuring that we could cut off financial support and other assistance such as gas for this unlawful blockade.
Great. Thank you very much. Madam Chair, through you, I will pass on to Ms. May. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nakvi, and thank you, Madam Chair. My question will be to CSIS Director, Mr. Vigneault. It's really the key to being able to invoke the Emergencies Act that the definition of threats to the security of Canada under the Canadian Security Intelligence Service Act be met, and that act being the act that governs CSIS. I think you're the most familiar with it of anyone before us today. And I wonder if you would know, and if you didn't know, is it findable to know, not the details, because those might still be considered secret, but how many times in the use of the Act has a situation or event been seen by CSIS to meet the definition of a threat to the security of Canada?
So thank you very much for the question, and I think there are a couple of elements, Ms. May, that you're putting in this. It is absolutely accurate that the Emergencies Act is using the...
1 minute.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were waving me off. I'm sorry, Madam Chair. So it is absolutely true that the Emergencies Act is using the CSIS definition, but it's also very clear that the Governing Council, when it decides to invoke the Emergencies Act, is using all sorts of information, and it does not rely solely on CSIS. It may or may not even be appropriate to use information from CSIS depending on the situation.
You may have misunderstood my question. I know I don't have much time left. How many times has CSIS, in other instances, historically, how many times would CSIS have found a threat to the security of Canada?
Actually, on a regular, every day that we CSIS, we investigate, as per our act, we investigate issues related to the threat to the safety of Canada. So every day, unfortunately, CSIS employees and professionals are uncovering and investigating threats to the security of Canada.
Thank you. I won't go on, Madam Chair, because I know probably out of time, but you probably, if it's every day, then it's been thousands of times.
Okay, time is up. Sorry, thank you, Ms. May. We'll go now to Monsieur Fortin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to get back to Ms. Lucki. I just want to make sure that I understand your testimony properly. You've been a police officer for how long? How long have you been with the RCMP, Ms. Lucki?
Madame Lucki? Myself, okay. 36 years.
Depuis combien de temps êtes-vous membre?
How long have you been a member of the RCMP?
1986.
Okay.
Okay. Have you ever faced situations of protests in Canada, or was this the first time that you saw this kind of protest in our streets?
I am actually trained public order commander, but this is the first time I've ever seen a protest such as this.
Such as, wait.
Okay, I understand, as you said earlier, that the other protests elsewhere in Canada were ended without needing the Emergency Act. Is that what you said?
The benefit of hindsight, obviously, of what happened in Ottawa, so we could change our tactics to ensure that, for example, big trucks would not stop in the area or park or disable.
Why didn't you do the same thing in Ottawa? Why didn't you prevent trucks from blocking Wellington Street?
Well, Ottawa Police Service is probably in a better position to answer that, but what I would say is that...
Le chef de police d'époque nous...
The police chief at the time said that he didn't know how he could do that. But as you see, it's kind of worrisome, Ms. Lucki. I'm sure that you're a competent woman and do your job right, but we're lacking information here. Something doesn't make sense. Because when I listen to you and when I listen to Mr. Vigneault, what I understand is that everywhere else, this was solved without the Emergencies Act. But in Ottawa, we know there was a barbecue and a spa in the streets. There were a certain number of people protesting, and you didn't manage to do it. And you're saying the reason you didn't do it is that there were no tow trucks available. Are you telling me that the security of Canada is imperiled because you can't find a tow truck? Is that your testimony?
No, every protest is completely different.
But this particular one on Wellington Street, Ms. Lucki, we don't have a lot of time. I know it's not polite to interrupt you, but we don't have much time. You said those others were solved. But on Wellington, there were protesters who blocked streets with trucks. They had spas, they had barbecues, they had a slide for kids, what have you. It was a party on Wellington Street. And you're telling me that the RCMP, the OPP, the Municipal Police of Ottawa, nobody could do anything because they didn't have tow trucks. That's what you said earlier. I'm worried because I hope there's never any war in Ottawa because that won't be funny. But is that really the problem? They couldn't find tow trucks?
No, that's not at all what I was trying to say. I think I've been
misinterpreted.
Well, you said earlier we couldn't act because we didn't have towing. That's your testimony earlier.
In Coutts, Alberta, that's exactly right. We had an enforcement plan. We were ready to go in. We had tow trucks available. When we started the enforcement the next day, the tow trucks had been secured, and when we started to enforce the next day, the tow trucks would not cooperate. So we had to readjust our plan.
Oui, mais c'est ça, mais vous...
Okay, but you did readjust your plan there. But here in Ottawa, you're before Parliament. You're right in front of Parliament of Canada. There are municipal police forces, provincial, the RCMP. It's so serious that the Prime Minister proclaims the Emergencies Act for the first time in 50 years. He proclaims this Emergencies Act, and you, the police services, I'm convinced that you were able to act. I don't want to blame you, but your testimony is that you couldn't do anything. You could not put an end to a protest in front of the Parliament of Canada, tow some trucks, remove a spa, remove the barbecues. I just can't believe this. You did do it because there was 1 week of this Emergencies Act and then it ended. So how can you justify that you weren't able to do it without this War Measures Act, or Emergencies Act? It's quite worrisome, Ms. Lucki.
Well, the Emergency Act provided authorities to serve as both a deterrent and to reduce the footprint so that we could safely do enforcement action, because there was a massive amount of people in the location in Ottawa, and it's never safe when you're at the maximum amount of people. So as the people...
Commissioner Lucki, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off. Time is up. We'll go to Mr. Green.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to Mr. Vigneault. Mr. Vigneault, as you know, under the Emergency Act, we need to satisfy that there was a national emergency. And I feel that at the heart of this committee, what we're trying to get to is the nature of the threat and whether or not this could not have been effectively dealt with under any other law in Canada. That seems to be, for me, the foundation from which we're exploring in this committee. So I'll ask you again, sir, did CSIS assess the threat for security in relation to Section 2D of the CSIS Act? And I'll even give it to you. You don't have to provide details. But did you see it, the MOU, and the current situation as a threat as defined in your act?
Thank you, Mr. Green. And I know you're looking for some level of precision that unfortunately cannot provide you in this context.
When you say this context, sir, if we go in camera, Madam Chair, I'll say through you, sir, if you're acknowledging you're not going to answer my question, I'll accept that. But I want to know, if we were to go in camera, given the nature of this committee, we've all been sworn in. We've identified that this is a coordinating authority with the courts, i.e. as important as a quasi-judicial committee for the purpose of this review, the only one such that's parliamentary. If in a future meeting we go in camera at that time, would you be prepared to live up to your duty of candor and provide the most basic information? Otherwise, sir, having you present at committee without answering that most basic question, to me, seems to be a bit of a futile exercise.
Mr. Green, you asked me to respect my duty of candor. I told you that I will absolutely respect that. I also have to respect the law of the land, which is also preventing me from answering classified information in a public setting.
Okay, so in camera, I've heard now that at a future meeting we'll invite you back and hopefully get to the heart of this matter, because I do, and in fact, think that that this was unique in nature, and I do feel that it is because of the failure of policing, Madam Chair. The utmost failure of policing. So I'm going to take my questions back to Commissioner Lucki, recognizing that throughout the events that led to the declaration, there have been many concerns about the conduct of police officers across the country, which include officers who are donating money, publicly announcing their support, and in fact taking part in the convoy, which to me is the uniqueness of this situation. Not the tow trucks, but the collusion, aiding and abetting by our security apparatus, including the police. So, for example, Durham Regional Police Constable, who publicly professed support for the convoy, was charged with discreditable conduct and other offenses under the PSA. 2 officers from Edmonton were suspended without pay for participating in the rally in support of the convoy at Coutts. An officer from Ottawa confirmed that it was investigating officers who allegedly supported the convoy. Included 6 officers whose names appeared on a leaked list of donors on the crowdsourcing platform of Give, Send, Go. In an unprecedented way, we watched police hand in hand with protesters here in Ottawa. We watched handshakes and hugs in Coots after weapons were found. So has the RCMP also conducted an investigation regarding the conduct of their officers during these events? Commissioner Lucki.
Thank you for that question. There were any of the people that actually were in misconduct. Most all were on leave without pay, and I have to say that public trust is obviously essential for the RCMP to really effectively serve and protect.
So will they be disciplined when they come back, or is that their discipline?
No, absolutely not.
What disciplinary actions will be taken towards the RCMP officers resulting from misconduct during the convoy?
Anytime there is allegations of misconduct, an investigation is done, and in regards to contraventions of the code of conduct, which we take very seriously, and we're committed to handling all the
what security risk, Commissioner? What security risk does it pose that individuals from the RCMP and the military, with experience and training, were involved in the logistics of the convoy?
The ones that we were aware of, there was first of all one that was no longer in the RCMP. That
sure,
was
but had the training. A sniper, in fact, on the Prime Minister's detail.
The person was no longer within the employ of the RCMP at the time of assisting the convoy.
So what risk do these individuals possess, given the knowledge that they have? Is this unique in nature? Have you ever seen police officers and military participating in civic disorder like this before?
Personally, no. And, information is not a problem. It's how the information is used. So if the information is used for good, then it's not a problem, obviously. But if it isn't, then it could pose a problem.
Particularly when they're talking about dropping bullets in
Mr.
people's heads. Is that correct?
Mr. Green, your time is up.
Madam Senator, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My question goes to Commissioner Lucki. I want to ask you to give a picture, and perhaps Deputy Commissioner Duheme is in better position to do that, whoever. We keep hearing about the convoy on Wellington Street. In fact, the convoy had an impact far beyond Wellington Street in the city of Ottawa. And so I'm interested in knowing a better picture for members of the public on the type of space that was occupied in streets. I don't know if you have it by kilometers or such. And if you can give me a context for people who aren't familiar with the area in Ottawa.
Yeah, I will pass that to my colleague, but what I can do is I can start off by saying we sort of divided it into 8 different zones that in conjunction, obviously, we were working with the Ottawa Police Service and OPP, and there was 8 different zones of 8 different types of groups, and I will maybe Deputy Commissioner Duheme can give a bit more description.
Thank you, Commissioner. Madam Chair, to the best of my recollection, as the Commissioner mentioned, there was 7 to 8 specific zones that we're looking at. There was one off of Waller and Nicholas, and there was also one at the Sussex and Rideau. Obviously, the most popular one was the one in front of Parliament Hill. There was one further down on Bronson. There was one on the Sir John A. Macdonald Parkway, I believe, and there's another 1 or 2 that was south to that. And the plan was, when we did it, is to go from one site to the other. And by the time we cleared the 3rd site, all the other sites or remaining sites were gone.
So from a perspective of members of the public who live here in the city of Ottawa, it was substantially more than just Wellington Street.
That's correct.
That's correct. Thank you. And going back to the integrated command, and perhaps, Deputy, this may be for you as well. Can you explain how the integrated command started and at what point it started, and then how it ended up at the end? And I appreciate that integrated command, at least in my understanding, would be the police jurisdiction, the Ottawa Police, the provincial jurisdiction, the OPP, and yourselves with other agencies assisting. But in the joint command, I would think that it would be the 3 of you. Am I correct on that?
So that's correct. And as I mentioned earlier, Madam Chair, the NCRCC was the first one that was set up. But when it started getting bigger and bigger, we formed the Integrated Command Center. And as you mentioned, the OPP, OPS, and us were at that. And that was really to plan the way forward for the intervention of the illegal protests.
Can you tell me then whether or not there was planning that was in place prior to the protests taking place as vehicles were coming across the country to take up their place here in Ottawa?
From an RCMP's perspective, we were looking at the planning from our federal mandate for protectees and assistance to Parliamentary Protective Service. The main lead on that as a convoy was coming was OPS. It's after that we got integrated when the resources were added to OPS.
Okay.
Well, and we can add that we did follow the convoy from across the country. So when they started at various areas, many of them started within RCMP jurisdictions. So we were providing on-ground information to the Ontario Police when they were crossing into their borders, and everything was funneled in through an integrated, like a joint intelligence group.
Okay, thank you. So there would be a significant amount of work and documents that might be somewhere that would outline at least where you started and what you anticipated as the police agencies who would deal with this ultimately, and then where you find yourself at the end of that process. At least that's how my recollection would be that it would be put together. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, all the documentation's being funneled through PCO. We were asked to provide all documents that we had in regards to the convoy protests.
But it would also be in the hands, at least at the provincial and the local level, so that when we see other police agencies who will come before this committee, we'll be able to at least get some information, I suspect, from them in terms of how they viewed the convoy here. Thank you.
I would imagine,
so
yeah.
Just very quickly, and I want to do a comparison between Windsor and what was occurring in Ottawa. And Windsor, am I correct? My recollection, I haven't been in that area in a while, but my recollection would be it's a one lane in, one lane out type of road, and so matter from managing it's a little bit easier than manage the size that you indicated here in terms of the occupation. Am I correct on that?
Yes.
Thank you.
I will now return the chair, Madam Senator.
Thank you very much. Senator Carignan.
Thank you. My questions will be for Ms. Lucki. You seem, I understand from your testimony that you had trouble finding tow trucks. Can you tell us how many tow truck companies you went to ask them to come and tow some trucks?
Yeah, I will pass that to my colleague from Contract Policing who was with the Alberta protest in Coots.
I'm talking about Ottawa.
Oh, that I don't know.
Mais plusieurs.
Several?
I would imagine there were several, but we did have several within our compound after the Emergency Act was invoked. We were able to get
Madame la
quite a few
Présidente,
tow
point
trucks.
d'ordre.
Point of order. We don't have any interpretation, apparently.
We'll stop the clock then and let me
Yes, please
check.
stop the clock.
Je peux essayer en
Sorry?
français.
I could speak French.
Whether
Je
that
peux
is working
essayer.
on the French channel?
Là, j'entends l'interprète, oui. Alors, ça va être
I hear the interpreter in French. I only had 30 seconds. You'll hear my French. So, I understand that you requested many tow truck companies, and none of them agreed to tow the trucks. Is that correct?
Not sure how many because I was able to delegate the authority to compel tow trucks to the OPP commissioner.
Okay. Et,
Okay. You are familiar with Section 121 of the Criminal Code that says that anyone who refuses to help a peace officer who's executing his duties by arresting somebody or preserving peace after reasonable warning could be imprisoned up to 2 years. That is the article of the Criminal Code. Are you familiar with that?
Not recently, but I'll believe what you say.
okay. Donc,
Okay. So how many companies or directors of tow companies that were accused of preventing police work under Article 129 or Section 129?
I'm not familiar with anybody being charged under that act of the criminal code.
Okay.
Okay. So you had the power to force tow trucks to operate under Section 121 and 134.1 of the Ontario Highway Code. What did the Emergencies Act add to this? I know that it says that you could force towing, but you already had the power to force towing to happen.
Under the criminal code, you can charge somebody, and if they are fined, in fact, there was tow truck companies who were receiving funds through the protest not to assist with us, and some of the individuals in the companies were very worried about their safety and their livelihood, and they were experiencing a lot of harassment. So even under a charge, it would go to court. Under the Emergency Acts, it compelled them to provide the service immediately. And so that was sort of the cover that they could use. They were no longer making the decision themselves. They were being forced under the authority of the Emergency Act.
Mais c'était la même chose.
But the same was true under the criminal code. You could have forced them.
Well, we could force them with a ability of a charge, and if they refuse, then we would lay the charge, and then they would go to court.
Exactly. But you didn't do that.
No, it wasn't done, to my knowledge.
I have no further questions.
Senator Harder.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, I'd like to follow up on your earlier testimony. You informed us that in your view, the events in Ottawa and elsewhere were not a failure of policing. You also, if I'm correct, said that your plan that you were developing around February 12th did not assume the emergency measures being invoked, and that you had confidence in that plan. In light of that testimony, I wonder if you could comment on a statement made by the Chief of the Ottawa Police Services, Peter Slowly, on the 2nd of February, during the events leading up to the declaration, where he was quoted in the media as saying that in his opinion, at least at that time, there, quote, may not be a police solution to the protests. Did you share that view? Did the RCMP share that view?
It's hard for me to evaluate or pass judgment on Chief Slowly, but I will say that I do believe there's always enforcement options when people are not, when you try to talk to people, and if they don't want to move in compliance without enforcing, you can always put together an enforcement plan, a safe enforcement plan, but you have to reduce the footprint in order to do that.
But at that time, the Ottawa had invoked an emergency measures, and it appeared not to be working, at least from the testimony, public comments of the then police chief. Would you not agree?
Yeah, I know they had police liaison teams that were trying to motivate people and convince people to leave the area, and I don't think that it was working.
Yeah. Commissioner, on the 15th of February, the CBC reported that police sources had said that the RCMP had delayed requests for additional resources here in Ottawa because the Ottawa Police Services had failed to provide, quote, a firm operational plan. Is that true?
We provided several resources up to the point of the just prior to the enforcement plan being put in place. And so when there was additional requests for resources, we were inquiring as to how they were going to use those additional resources, because for us to get additional resources, we'd have to go across outside of Ontario and Quebec. So we wanted to make sure that there was a plan in place to use those resources.
And that plan on February 15th presumably would be with the authorities that the emergency invocation provided.
Yeah, well, the plan started. The plan started before the invocation and into the invocation. And we assisted OPS in the execution of that plan.
Is it your testimony that while the emergency invocation was not necessary for the plan that you had been developing, did it provide the police authorities that were helpful after the 14th of February in executing the plan?
Yeah, absolutely. The provisions, they granted the RCMP and policing partners new authorities that would reduce that footprint, because there's no way we could enforce with the maximum amount of people there. And there was a large group that refused to leave. And no matter what things were tried by the police, there was a group that just would not leave. So we needed ways to, first of all, stop additional people from coming in. So therein lied the perimeter that was put around the city, and we would stop convoys that were heading from across the country. They would be stopped on roadsides or on roads coming towards Ottawa. We also motivated people to leave by providing the information to the banks. And we had one example where one of the individuals said he must leave because he got a call from his spouse and was told that their bank account was frozen and that he needed to leave or else they wouldn't be able to access.
I'm going to get cut off in a few seconds, but I just want to emphasize that in my view, the actions by police prior to the invocation of the Act demonstrated a series of police failures, not willful failures, but the inability of police to contain and act appropriately in reducing the occupation here in Ottawa. And I find it surprising that you would say that there has been no failure of policing in respect of these incidences. Thank you.
Oh, I think police. Oh.
Senator White.
Very much, Madam Chair, and thanks again to the witnesses. I'm looking at the Emergencies Act, or the Emergencies Act in the City of Ottawa was invoked. The province identified that it was an emergency as well amid convoy protests. In fact, fines of up to $100,000 for anybody who were to block and impede. Did neither of those pieces of legislation give tools to law enforcement to actually have a positive movement when it came to removing people from in front of Parliament Hill? Certainly would be deemed critical infrastructure, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure specifically on the powers that the city invoked, but I know that some of the provincial, when the province invoked the Emergencies Act, there was powers that were included. I don't recall what they were offhand, but I could pass it to my partner, Deputy Commissioner Mike Duheme might have an idea of those.
Please, I appreciate that.
Yeah, Mr. Senator White, I'm not aware of any application of that in the downtown core. That would be better suited to Ontario Police or the OPS, but from the RCMP's perspective, we haven't enforced that one.
But you were sitting at Joint Command at that point, right, Deputy? So there was no discussion around these new powers we have as a result of these new two pieces of legislation that were invoked provincially and municipally?
Yeah, I don't have the finite details of those, but I don't recall being used in downtown Ottawa. Not to say that it weren't used in other parts of Ontario, but I don't recall that.
Okay, thanks, Deputy. And now that you've been thrown into the breach, I'll stick with you. There have been suggestions that the only way you could get RCMP officers actually to operate quickly and efficiently in the downtown core of Ottawa was to the Emergency Act, because you would not have to swear them in. But how many times have you been sworn in under the Provincial Police Act of Ontario? More than once?
Police Act, once, I believe, assisting Canada many years ago. But we were Senator White, quite rapid in getting our resources sworn in from OPS. We had an excess of 400 people sworn in initially to assist OPS.
But we did that all the time. We didn't need the Emergencies Act to do that. I think we swore in 400 to 700 every Canada Day, and it would last for a year. In fact, I used to joke that if they'd moved Canada Day one day earlier, I wouldn't have to do it twice. So, I mean, they didn't need the Emergencies Act to swear in police officers. It happens all the time.
That's correct.
Thank you very much. Can Can you tell me if you had any discussions with anybody from PMO in relation to the invocation of the Emergencies Act prior to the date of an invocation?
Is that addressed to me or the Commissioner?
Yes, no, to you, and then it'll go to the Commissioner next.
I had no dealings with PMO throughout the incident.
Commissioner, how about yourself? No, PMO,
I
yes.
updated PMO specifically. I updated the government, which included the Prime Minister, on the situation across the country.
But again, you did not make recommendation that the Emergencies Act be invoked.
No, when they had decided on some of the authorities, they consulted with the RCMP as well as other police agencies to see if any of those authorities that they were contemplating would assist us and if they would be useful.
And that was prior to the invocation?
Yes.
So there were discussions in the days leading up to the invocation about the potential invocation of the Emergencies Act?
Yes.
And what tools you would need?
I can't get into the details of specific discussions, but I can say that, yeah.
Why can't we get into the details, Commissioner? Sorry.
Well, because they were within cabinet, and I'm bound by that cabinet confidence. But I can talk about in general. I provided the situational report, which would have provided them the details that they needed to come up with some of the measures. When they did come up with measures, they came to us to say, would these measures be useful? And then when they were revoking, of course, they came again to us and said, are you in a position that you no longer need the additional authorities? So it was a consultation.
At any time, did you recommend that anyone apply for an injunction to try and utilize the tools that an injunction would give you in relation to the protest here in downtown Ottawa?
No, not myself or the RCMP, no.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. We will suspend for 10 minutes and then we'll rejoin.
Thank you very much again, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for remaining with us. I just want to take you back, both Commissioner and Mr. Vigneault, to both your statements, and it was appropriate statements. Mr. Vigneault, you said first that violent extremists use protests as a platform. I believe, Commissioner, you said that the violent extremists will leverage protests and protest-type activities for their purpose. And I appreciate both of the perspective on that. And I also want to commend the RCMP for their handling of the issue with firearms in Coutts. I was on the ground and spoke with command there and was very impressed with the work being done and their interaction with protesters and other. But what I wanted to do, Commissioner, and just to confirm from you, I was very impressed with the news release that the RCMP put out in regards to the firearms found at Coutts. And I know that that media and members of the government would love to suggest that the firearms found there were protester firearms. But, again, that's where I commend the RCMP for their thorough and very exact use of words in that release. They said that a criminal organization used the protest, just like, they leveraged that protest, and they weren't connected to the protest. They used that opportunity to propagate their own violence. And I just want to confirm that statement from you, that that's exactly what happened, that violent extreme group with ties back here to Ottawa, criminal organization, that Mr. Vigneault knows well, was there on the ground and used that opportunity and was not part of the protest. They just used that as a platform. Would that be accurate based on your news release?
Yeah, that was according to the news release. I don't think we made quite a connection to Ottawa with that group yet.
Okay, maybe I'm inside baseball. Sorry. And I thank you for that, and thank you for both of you for your involvement in dealing with that particular type of threat. Mr. Vigneault, I have a couple questions for you, if I could, please. Now, did you receive, or did CSIS, not you, did CSIS receive any intel of any kind on the Freedom Convoy here in Ottawa from the Canadian military?
I do not, Mr. Motz, thank you. I do not remember specifically, but it would not be unusual to have for CSIS members throughout the country to receive information. I do not recall specifically, however.
Okay. And I mean, I know this may not be your, it's got nothing to do with you, but the use of the surveillance plane over the convoy protest here in Ottawa during the time of the protest. I'm just curious to know whether the information gathered there was shared with you or any other intel agency that you're aware of.
I am only aware of the spy plane, as you call it, from the media. So we have not had any involvement.
Okay. Now, I want to go back to Commissioner Lucki. We didn't really finish our opening line of questioning about Section 5 of the RCMP Act. And now you hold that office under the direction of the Minister of Public Safety, correct? Yes. Now, did the Minister of Public Safety or any government minister ever offer you direction under Section 5 to deploy RCMP resources to deal with the convoy protests?
No, the minister is very, very conscious of not providing direction, and we remind ourselves at each and every meeting just so that we're clear on the rules of engagement.
Okay, and did you at any point up to or during the convoy protest inform or remind the minister that he has that legislative power under Section 5?
No.
Why would you, right? Section 20 of the RCMP Act also says that the minister may enter into arrangements with any province or any municipality to aid in the administration of justice and carry into effect laws enforced therein. Did the minister ever talk about invoking the RCMP Act to possibly deal with the protests?
No, we have under the PP, the Provincial Policing Service Arrangements or Agreements, we have Section 9, which the commanding officer, if he or she requires additional resources, we would ask for Section 9, which has to go through the minister to the provinces.
So one last quick question. So we know in comparison we had the...
Sorry, Mr. Mott, your time is up.
Oh.
Thank you, Mr. Motz. We'll move to Mr. Lamoureux.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And, you know, I want to try to get a couple of really good, quick questions in. You know, when I think of the whole issue of the threshold, I really appreciated, Ms. Lucki, when you said that this is really the first time you saw a protest such as this. A couple of things came to my mind when you said that. One is the fact that Ottawa, the city of Ottawa stated a state of emergency. The province of Ontario stated a state of emergency. And in fact, my home province, there was an interesting letter that was written by the Premier in which it's been cited through the Free Press as saying that in February 11th letter, the Premier was pleading with the Prime Minister to intervene at the Emerson border blockade just days before. In the February 11th letter, it stated that the Premier asked the Prime Minister to take immediate and effective action as she pleaded for national leadership that only the federal government could provide. In fact, it goes further on to say that in the letter, the situation was so urgent and blockades that disrupt this critical corridor, even temporarily, created potential dangers, imposed severe hardships on all Manitobans, and caused severe economic loss and damage to Manitoba and the Canadian businesses. Then I also believe the province of Alberta, I think it might have been the Minister of Transport, said that, look, we can't get these trucks moved because we don't have tow trucks, and appealing to Ottawa. And I don't know exactly which minister it was, but I would suspect that you would have been aware of all the things that I mentioned, Ms. Lucki?
Yeah, not in detail, but yes.
Yes. Now, when you made the comment that this is the first time you saw a protest such as this, can you recall when you've had different levels of government, different provincial governments all coming to Ottawa in dealing with the national protests? Can you recall anything of that nature?
Not off the top of my head, no.
Interesting. Okay, you know, there was another thing that I thought was interesting. There was some members of Parliament, and this is a wonderful quote. I gotta love this. It says, you know, someone in my riding, she had her bank account frozen for buying a $20 Freedom of Convoy t-shirt. Now, I listened to your comments, and it seems to go at odds with something of anyone purchasing a t-shirt and then getting their bank account frozen. Are you aware of anything of that nature?
No, we did not target people who donated to the convoy. We only provided names of people who were within the illegal blockades, names or driver information, and the protest organizers. But nobody who is simply donating or buying merchandise for the protest, unless they were inside the blocked area, would their name have been provided.
So I can tell my constituents, as I did, that look, if you just purchased a t-shirt, you have nothing to fear. The RCMP and the banks are not going to freeze your account. That was good information me providing, correct?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. Do you actually have some latest figures for the number of accounts that have actually were frozen and how much money that they would have contained? And if so, would you be able to provide that to the committee?
Yes, I'll pass over to Deputy Commissioner Mike Duheme, who has those numbers.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate both of your presentations, and I believe Mrs. Bendayan has a couple of questions. After the answer, of course.
You're on mute.
Apologize for that. We froze, we submitted the information to the bank and they froze 257 financial products by different institutions, and these products would include bank, corporate accounts, and credit cards. And the disclosure of 57 entities to financial institutions. These includes individuals and owners or drivers of vehicles involved in the blockade, and identified also 170 Bitcoin wallet address that were shared with virtual currency exchangers. I don't have, unfortunately, I don't have a total amount what you're looking for.
Okay, go ahead, George.
Madam Chair, how much time is remaining? Can I, will there be a second round? There will not be another round after this?
Oh, perhaps.
Okay, I would.
Go quickly.
Well, I would add that to my next round. I believe we will have time for another round. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Moving then to Mr. Fortin.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do I add my 5 minutes to Ms. Bendayan's? No? So I'll go with Ms. Lucki, please. Ms. Lucki, I'm sorry. In your testimony earlier, you said, and I'm sorry again, I have a frog in my throat. You said that the situation was worsening every weekend here on the Hill, in Ottawa, on Wellington Street. Once again, I understand that elsewhere in Canada you put an end to this without the use of the Emergencies Act, but here we understand that there were problems, and this was proclaimed on February 14th. But before that, I understand you had formed a cooperative team with the OPP and the OPS. You're saying the situation increased every weekend. Every weekend, things were getting worse. So my question, Ms. Lucki, is were you expecting any particular incident or a moment before intervening? Why did the situation get worse and worse? What were you waiting for? And you kept waiting. Why were you waiting?
I would say from the RCMP policing perspective, the blockade in Ottawa, it was supported and organized by several organizers who were able to obtain significant amounts of funding. And so that changed it. It was in an urban environment as opposed to a rural environment.
I'm sorry. I don't want to interrupt you. It's the same rule as earlier. We have very little time. What were you waiting for? You said the situation kept worsening every weekend. What were you waiting for specifically? Were you waiting for a specific event, an authorization in particular, or a moment in time? What were you waiting for to intervene when you noted that the situation was getting worse and worse every week?
We were there to assist with the police of jurisdiction, who is Ottawa Police Service. So I can't say what they were waiting for. I can say that the funding allowed the protest to grow, particularly over the weekends, and
OK, mais ça, vous ne pouvez pas répondre.
Okay, but you can't answer. I understand that it was the Ottawa Police, but you had a team. You said that you were consulting one another with the provincial police and the municipal police of Ottawa and the RCMP. You were all working together. That's what you said. You say, we're all working together. We see the situation getting worse week after week. What did you, Ms. Lucki, you who are leading up the RCMP, what were you waiting for to say, enough is enough, we're going to intervene?
Well, what I wanted to see was a solid enforcement plan, and that was put together by the Ontario Police. And
Mais vous nous avez dit que vous...
Yes, but you told us that you had that solid plan on February 12th. That's what you said earlier. So you were only waiting for that.
Together. No, we brought planners together, and we put together a plan, which was a massive amount of resources were required. We needed to bring the resources into the city because the plan required more resources than we had on the ground. So we brought resources from across the country.
Okay, what resources, Ms. Lucki? What resources did you bring in from elsewhere in the country?
I will pass that to my colleague, Mike Duheme, who is running the...
I'd like to hear your answer. What were you personally waiting for? You're the boss. Am I wrong? Aren't you the boss?
Yes, I am.
OK, alors vous, qu'est-ce...
Okay, so you personally, what were you waiting for? You said, I was waiting for resources coming from elsewhere. What resources?
Resources from Regina City Police, from RCMP across the country, from Saskatoon Police, from Calgary Police, I believe. There was resources from all over the country that were being brought in, officers from across the country, so that we could effectively enforce going into that last week.
OK, je comprends. Donc, c'est des...
Okay, understand. So these are human resources, police officers. These weren't tow trucks or something. Okay, my last question, I have about 15 seconds. What would you do different today if a similar situation occurred again?
Well, the benefit of hindsight, obviously, when we were looking at the biker convoy that came through, we brought in lessons learned, of course, no stopping, blocking off certain areas, not allowing people to park and stop. A slow-moving protest is fine. Engaging with the protest organizers. In the motorcycle one, there was one. In the protest in Ottawa, there was over 7 and 8 different organizers. So it was hard to get any agreement amongst the various groups that were there because there was team captains from every part of the country. Obviously, we had the benefit of hindsight from what we learned from the protest in Ottawa, and we were able to use that for the Thunder convoy that came in a couple of weekends ago.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm afraid Mr. Fretin's time is up.
Thank you. And congratulations, Ms. Lucki, because that was a good intervention.
Mr. Green.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to Commissioner Lucki. Lessons learned on the Rolling Thunder. The lessons that you listed seemed pretty obvious, did they not, Commissioner Lucki? It wouldn't take the retrospect of an Emergencies Act to learn those lessons. Is that not fair to say?
I don't attach the lessons learned to any act.
The Emergencies Act, the invocation for which you are providing testimony for.
Yeah, any of the lessons learned, when we look at the lessons learned, we look at the types of resources we brought in,
okay, thank
the type of plan we had. Yeah.
I'm challenged, and I'm trying to not be frustrated, but I'm challenged by not drawing that very basic conclusion and that very basic comparison between the two. So let's do some more comparisons. In the lead up to Coots, it would be safe to say that the RCMP would have had investigations ongoing that ultimately led to the discovery of the weapons cache in Coots. Is that correct?
Yes.
So you would have known about that in advance. How far in advance would you have known that the Diagolon group was plotting for this type of intervention in Coots?
Not that far in advance, but I can't speak to any details because it's before the courts.
There'll be a response to that momentarily. Are you aware if there were members of Diagolon present in Ottawa?
I do not know that. I will pass that to.
That's okay. That's okay. I'll go. I want to stay on this, Commissioner Lucki, because this is important information. Understanding the investigation that was going on that ultimately led to the weapons cache, is it safe to say that the RCMP would have been at high alert given the high-risk nature of this investigation and arrest?
Yes, it was.
Did the RCMP dispatch ERTs to Coots, an ERT team, an emergency response team to Coots?
I believe at the point of execution of the search warrants, yes.
How long had the ERTs been involved in these occupations across the country?
Off and on, depending on the circumstances.
I call on that because, you know, for example, in November of 2021, the BC RCMP deployed military-style police tactical units, including snipers, lethal overwatch, heavily armed assault teams against unarmed Wet'suwet'en land defenders in northern British Columbia because they deemed it more practical. They deemed it more practical. Were any weapons ever found in the Wet'suwet'en territory as the small houses were chainsawed down and entries were forced on those camps?
I would have to pass that to my colleague who's in charge of contract and Indigenous policing, Brian Brennan.
Simple yes or no question to your colleague, if he could answer that. Were any weapons found on the site of the Wet'suwet'en land defenders?
I'm personally not aware of any weapons that were found during those searches.
Okay, and so here we have a situation, and again, I had asked this question through you, Madam Chair, to the Commissioner, a juxtaposition of policing, what I'll call a failure of policing. How is it that you reconcile the double standard in policing? And, you know, what would you say to Canadians who have questions about the conduct of RCMP officers giving handshakes and high fives and hugs shortly after these weapon stashes were found in what was admittedly a high-risk investigation and arrest?
Deputy Commissioner Brennan can answer that.
Well, Commissioner Lucki, this is a question for you.
Okay, what I can say is there was many legal protesters at the Coots protest, and our members who police there are part of the community. They shop in those stores. They're neighbors to those people.
So the protesters look like the police? They're from the same communities.
No,
they identify with the people in the community.
No, they live in those communities.
Would you acknowledge, given those two scenarios, the very different state of policing for Indigenous land defenders and people who may be more familiar to police being from their same communities? Can we acknowledge at least a double standard there?
No, not at all. There was many people on the Forestry Road in Wet'suwet'en. There was only one residence in the entire.
Sure, because they weren't a threat in the Wet'suwet'en, were they? Not to anybody else, but for the project. So I want you to comment quickly on would you not at least admit that there were kid gloves for the protesters in Coots directly after the discovery of the weapons cache?
No.
No.
No, there was protesters who approached our officers after those people were removed because they weren't part of the protest that the people who were involved in the convoy protest.
How do you know that to be true?
Okay, Mr. Green, sorry, I've given you a little bit of latitude. Thanks.
Well,
Mr. Green, can you take the chair?
I just need to stop. Thank you. Senator, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And my question, I think, would best be answered by Deputy Commissioner Duheme. I want to frame up what the Joint Command would look like. From my former questions, you would be in a Joint Command with 3 agencies. Can you tell me what the individual responsibilities would be of those in those command positions?
Yeah, in the integrated command center that we had, there was actually multiple law enforcement agencies that were there. At gold level, if you wish, which myself, Deputy Commissioner Harkin from OPP, and as well as the interim Chief of Police, Mr. Bell. Discussions ongoing on the way forward. Every plan that was set forward, we were in agreement with the plan that was going forward. So it wasn't necessarily a consensus, but everybody was in agreement as to how we're going to tackle this and the sequence of events as we move forward. OPS is one thing. I want to make clear that OPS maintained the lead throughout this. Both the RCMP and OPP were supportive throughout, but the Joint Command, there's conversation as the best way to proceed forward to address the situation.
The best way to deploy resources.
Exactly.
And so can you tell me then when that part of the Joint Command started as opposed to intelligence collecting and all those other things, what would be the time frame in that in relation to the declaration of the emergency?
I believe the ICC was stood up on February 12th. So this was before this February 12th.
And as a Joint Command, would you be in a position then to determine what your limitations were and what you were able to address through the declaration of emergency?
As of February 12th, we didn't have the Emergency Measures Act in place just yet, and we weren't even counting on that. We're planning accordingly with the existing authorities that we had.
Okay, and can you tell me then what you were faced with at that time on the 12th of February and how long the protests have been going on at that point?
They arrived in Ottawa, I believe it was around the 28th or 29th. As the Commissioner alluded to earlier, every weekend, the first weekend, we had in excess of 6,000 or 7,000 people on the Hill on the weekends in the downtown core. And the same that weekend when the ICC was struck up. And we were working with, we always plan for the worst case scenario as we move forward, but mindful that we want to resolve this at the lowest level.
I fully appreciate you would have people working on the ground trying to convince people to move away and to ease up the streets so the rest of the citizens could use them as well. But what I'm trying to really zero in on is the type of challenges that you had. And so, for instance, would I be correct in assuming that, at least from what I've read in the papers, that there was also a group that were forming a counter-protest leading up to the days that followed?
You are correct, Madam Chair. There was counter-protests as planned. I think the biggest challenge, as the Commissioner alluded to earlier, is the size, the funding, and several people use this platform to manifest their dissatisfaction with either COVID, the government, or any other element that they could. So it drew a lot of people. And what's interesting is when the Emergency Measures Act was invoked, that weekend, we no longer saw 5,000 people converge downtown. It was less, so it acted as a deterrent. But the challenge was the size, the number of people, and one of the concerns was the safety of police officers that were out there.
Absolutely. And so when you're looking at a protest and a counter-protest from an officer's perspective, or particularly given the challenge you have, it is a unique challenge because officers have to watch their back from both sides. Would that not be correct?
That's correct, Madam Chair.
So obviously in your discussions you anticipated some of that, and your plan would have included how to address those issues.
They were addressed, and on the ground we have public liaison team units that reach out to the leaders or to the organizers to explain. And if my memory serves me right, I think some of the counter-protests didn't go forward because we were able to convince people that was a good thing.
And you weren't as successful convincing people to leave and go home?
No.
Thank you.
Senator, the chair is now back to you.
Senator Carignan.
Inaudible. I was looking at press clippings about the Ottawa interim police chief, Chief Bell. On February 12th, he seemed to have a plan. He was satisfied with the plan. There was a reduction in the number of protesters. People had started to leave. That's what he said at a press conference. You were there. What was the plan on February 12th?
On February 12th, the original plan was presented to Chief Slowly, but what we had done is, I'm just looking at some of my dates, it wasn't until close to February 16th and 17th that we started providing going into the actual initial plans of providing people the options to leave and moving forward and going into each sector of the downtown core.
But the plan was established on the 12th, executed on the 13th?
Il était mis ensemble le 12?
Was put together on the 12th? Okay, so you just continued to apply the plan.
No, well, we had to gather additional resources because the plan, once we look at the plan is approved, and with that plan comes additional human resources. So we had to get the human resources into the Ottawa downtown.
Okay, donc le plan.
Okay, so the plan was established on the 12th. You needed additional resources. The resources arrived later, after the 12th, maybe the 14th or 15th, and then you executed the plan.
So the ICC was established on the 12th of February. The planning team cell was put together, and by the 15th, the plan had been established with the resources, and then we were bringing the resources into the Ottawa core. And it was around the 17th when we started providing warnings to the protesters to vacate the National Capital Region. And as well, we had the OPS and other law force secure a perimeter, and then that's when the arrests began.
Okay, and when you established the plan on the 12th or 13th, how many police officers do you count on to help you?
I will pass that to Deputy Commissioner Mike Duheme.
Madame la Présidente, pour la question.
Madam Chair, in answer to Senator Carignan, I don't have the exact number of police officers who assisted, but I could add some information here. When it comes to troops who maintain order, who have helmets, and we needed 14 to come and help us to manage the situation. Those troops arrive from all across Canada, and that caused a delay to really activate the plan. On the 17th, we started to increase a number of warnings to people in the downtown area. Okay, but the initial plan on the 12th was executed. Well, I would say that on the 12th, it was being prepared. It kept being modified as things went on and evolved. I can't be sure to say that the plan of the 12th was executed. It changed continuously based on the environment we were in. Okay, fine. Mr. Beaudoin testified before the Commons Finance Committee on March 7th. He said that the RCMP gave the banks a document that could create antecedents for the police because this person was suspected of committing other crimes and may have other background. Can you tell us what that intelligence was that was provided to the banks other than just the occupation, the illegal occupation as designated persons? Yes, Madam Chair. We gave the information the banks needed whether they should freeze funds or not. Freezing funds came from the banks. We gave them the necessary information. They established a template that has to be filled out. Could we get a copy of that template that was sent to banking institutions? I have no objections. That's a blank document. It's not protected. Okay. And in that document, you would put the background of the person?
Senator Harder.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question goes to Director Vigneault. I know that you're feeling lonely in this round, and I'm trying to, make you part of the conversation. Director, I appreciate that you are circumscribed by law as to what you can tell us, but I'd like you to give us a bit more color on the nature of the IMVE threat in Canada, as you saw it in the context of the Freedom Convoy, and whether or not there was any evidence of IMVE collaboration with American or non-Canadian actors.
Thank you very much, Senator Arder, and I appreciate your generosity in bringing me into the conversation. So, as I mentioned before, what we're seeing is the phenomenon of IMVE has been increasing over the last number of years, mostly fueled by social media. And your reference, Senator, about the Americans or the American experience and connection. So the social media has no boundaries, and so we have seen individuals who have been inspired, who have colluded. We have examples, a public example. There is an individual in Canada, former RB corporal, who has been identified as a member of a listed entity under the Terrorism Act, that has essentially been gone to the U.S. for training. So we are aware that there are some of these cross-border issues, and we, with law enforcement, pay a lot of attention to it. In the context of the convoy, what we saw was a number of individuals that were of concerns to CSIS and known to CSIS before, had been interested by the convoy, had been interested by, in engaging in some of the online activity. And what we were very concerned with is their ability for some of these individuals to show up in different demonstrations in Ottawa and other places. So we have used our investigative resources to make sure that we had a good level of awareness of these known threats, and we're able to inform our law enforcement partners of these activities through the Joint Intelligence Group, but also to inform government about the nature of the threat to national security that was developing. And that's the nature of that specific assessment that I cannot go into more details, but I can tell you that, we have seen what we saw with the demonstration is a continuation and an amplification of some of the rhetoric, violent rhetoric, that exist on social media, that exist against the public health measures. And where we intervene, CSIS, is when that rhetoric turns into potential plots of violence. And so that is that complex phenomenon. I would also like to add, Senator Arder, that we are talking here with kind of, providing sometimes fairly definitive views, but it's also clear that, what we saw and what we knew then was fluid. We did not have the full picture, and that added to the level of uncertainty that everybody in terms that we were working with was feeling about how this very volatile demonstration was evolving. And I think these are some of the elements that would want to make sure that the Governing Council would have been aware of while making the decision to invoke or not the Emergencies Act.
Thank you very much. My next question is for Commissioner Lucki. You've talked a little bit about lessons learned. It seems to me that lessons are learned from failures. I don't want to dwell on whether or not there was police failure or policing failures, but I would like you to give us a little more color on lessons learned from this experience so that we never have to use the Emergencies Act again. Do you see that as part of your existing mandate?
Absolutely. We scrubbed down every incident to see what we can do better, and it showed itself even in RCMP jurisdiction during the Freedom Convoy, because we had the benefit of already lessons learned. First of all, not having big, trucks stopping. And when we got into Rolling Thunder, it was a whole different way of looking at things and not allowing the occupation to take place. I think when people came to Ottawa, people honestly thought that they were going to come, they were going to do their thing on the weekend, and they were going to leave after the first day that Parliament resumed. So obviously that didn't happen. And so when we've never dealt with protests. It's always been people. It's never been big 18-wheeler trucks. So not having them stop is really, really important, because it provides us the opportunity to avoid that occupation.
Question to end my testimony or my questioning. Was the RCMP part of the recommendation to revoke the act, or was that a surprise to you as well?
When the government went to look for the revocation, they obviously they would be remiss if they didn't come to us and say, you know, I provided regular briefings about the situation, and our primary concern was this public and officer safety, and so it was about, is it a safe time to take away some of the authorities that we had, and would that prevent from this reoccurring? So the government was looking for any assurances that, you know, if they took away the act, would things go back to the way they were? And that's what they were wanting to know. And so from our point of view, when we took control back of the city, we were confident that we could maintain that control.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Commissioner. Sorry to cut you off. Senator White.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Actually, a question for Deputy Commissioner Duheme, if I may. The Parliament of Canada Act was amended in 2015 to create the Parliamentary Protective Service. The Act states clearly that PPS operates under the operational command of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Did that command advise the city, the Ottawa Police Service, not to allow the convoy to have access to the Wellington Street in front of Parliament Hill prior to their arrival? For Deputy Duheme, please.
Yeah, Madame la Présidente, I'm unaware of the initial discussions that took place from the onset with OPS, their PLT, and the convoy. I'm not aware, PPS, yes, if you look at the MOU that's in place that dates back for 2015, the RCMP does have operational oversight of PPS. I would say, Senator, that the times have changed because we went down from 120 members to one RCMP member that's currently on the Hill. So I think that MOU would have to be looked at again. But
The member reports to you, though. Sorry to interrupt. The RCMP officer, the superintendent, acting chief superintendent, reports to the RCMP. And he oversees the hundreds of employees on Parliamentary Precinct, right?
He oversees and reports equally and administratively to both speakers of the House, but I do not recall any conversations with regards to the trucks. I do recall a conversation when they moved some trucks off the other streets and some came to park on Wellington, that he objected to that, and he did have conversations with the city on that.
Did you consider, again, understanding that the operational command reports to the RCMP for PPS, did you consider it high risk for parliamentarians and their staff because it was wide open from the protest or the occupation right onto the Hill? Did you consider it high risk?
Consider it high risk. We did put measures in place for that for the weekend when we went when we operationalized our plan, where we had we had 2 points where members of Parliament could rally to in coordination with Sergeant Arms, and that our VIP could escort them if they chose that option. I understand that some felt safe walking in the streets, adjacent streets, to get to Parliament. If it's highly volatile, we're in an environment that anything can go wrong at any minute because of the number of people that are there. So it is a consideration for us.
No, I understand that, but at no point in time was there any actions taken to block off Parliament Hill from the protesters, or no warnings were given to parliamentarians not to engage with anybody in that area. Nobody was told not to enter that area. So it wasn't considered such a high risk that we would have actually done anything to stop access.
I know, Senator, that the Sergeant at Arms has provided some information to the members of Parliament and also the employees, but I'm not quite sure of all the information or when it went out.
Well, apparently the Black Rod didn't care as much about us because he didn't give us any warnings. So, but I appreciate that. Next question I have, Deputy, if I may, in relation to all of the assets that were frozen by banks or financial institutions, have any charges been laid in relation to the utility of the money that was frozen? Any criminal charges laid against anybody or any organizations?
On the funds that were frozen from the platforms,
yes.
The RCMP does not have an active investigation on that. On the referrals to the financial institutions, no charges have been laid.
And none are expected, is that correct?
To my knowledge, no.
Okay, I'll allow Member of Parliament May to take the last. Oh, she's gone already, sorry. I'm finished. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll move to our final round then, and I believe Mr. Brock.
Thank you. A question to both Ms. Lucki and Mr. Vigneault. Public Safety Minister Mendocino is on record saying that Canadians would be troubled with anyone who associates themselves with the extreme statements that had been made by the purported leaders of the convoy that would seek to incite the overthrow of the government through violence. In reference to the Memorandum of Understanding and the manifesto of the convoy leaders, they sought the cooperation of the Governor General and the Senate to end all federal mandates and to replace the federal government with a new framework of governance which respects the human dignity of all Canadians. Where is the threat of violence in that?
To me, those are words, and people have extreme views. It's only when those extreme views go to violence that, of course, that's where our concern lies, and that's where we prioritize our enforcement efforts.
Did you have reasonable grounds to arrest based on those words?
We were very aware of those words.
Yes or no?
And we provided additional protection to the Governor General for that reason.
Yes or no? Were there reasonable grounds for you to believe an offense had been committed in relation to the Memorandum of Understanding and the manifesto?
Not yet.
Okay.
No, not at that
point. To Mr. Vigneault. Same question.
Sorry, same question. So I cannot speak for what Minister had in mind when he made those comments, but our assessment of the manifesto was obviously something of concern that we needed to understand if there were either the specific manifesto or other people that would be influenced by that manifesto.
Did you recommend that criminal charges be laid, sir?
That the CSIS does not have the power to recommend any criminal charges. That's not in our act.
Thank you. Deputy Commissioner OPP in Public Safety Committee several weeks ago indicated that 1 week prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, so by simple math, that would be February the 7th, that they had declared, the OPP had declared that there was a national emergency. So my question to both individuals is in relation to the convoy itself. This was a convoy that was permitted by Ottawa Police Service and City Council and Mayor as to where to park. There was an off-site location in terms of supplies and the supply route, etc. I asked this question several times to ministers with a zero response. I'm hoping the two of you can provide a response. What was the event that turned this lawful assembly as protected by Charter 2, B, C, and D? What event occurred that caused this to be an illegal blockade and thus a national emergency? To both witnesses.
I will say that from the very onset, it was very soon that it was not a legal protest. It was an illegal blockade. And as far as the threshold, that's not for me to comment. I can only comment on the act itself and how we used it. But
you're part of the Integrated Command Center, Ms. Lucki. That information must have been shared with you. So what was the information that was shared with you?
I'm not a decision maker when it comes to.
I'm not asking for your decision. I'm asking, the OPP had declared that 1 week before the invocation, there was an event that they deemed to constitute a national emergency. What was shared with you as part of the Integrated Command Center?
There was operational specifics on the ground. It was known to the RCMP that there were some individuals within the convoy who posed potential threats to national security. We had no level of certainty about the capability, about the intent, and if a nexus to national security would be identified, the RCMP would.
Thank you. The Emergency Act provides offenses, a fine of up to $100,000 and a term of imprisonment for not more than 1 year. You'd agree with me, Ms. Lucki, that there were no charges laid under the Emergencies Act by way of those offenses in relation to the Ottawa convoy?
Not to the ones you're referring to, no.
And in fact, all of the other blockades across Canada, before and after the invocation of the Act, not one charge under the Emergencies Act, correct?
Not to my knowledge.
All charges were criminal code related and Provincial Highway Traffic Act related or municipal bylaws, correct?
Outside of Ottawa, yes.
Thank you. Does the RCMP possess the technical capacity to detect explosive materials in a non-invasive fashion?
I don't get into specific techniques, but in certain circumstances, we do have capabilities.
Is it true that the RCMP denied
Sorry,
or ignored
Mr.
requests
Brock.
from the OPS or the
Mr.
Parliamentary
Brock?
Protective Service?
I'm
Thank
sorry, you're well past. Madame Badayan, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'll go quite quickly, Commissioner and witnesses, because my time is limited. Just picking up on this last line of questioning, it's my understanding that the Emergencies Act didn't create new criminal charges. Therefore, there was no ability under the Emergencies Act to do anything other than enforce existing criminal law or highway safety law.
We use the criminal code to lay charges of criminal nature, yes.
Of course. And my colleagues also touched on the cache of weapons that was seized on February 14th by the RCMP in Coutts. That included 13 long guns, handguns, multiple sets of body armor, 1 large machete, a large quantity of ammunition, and high-capacity magazines. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe so.
And is RCMP Superintendent McHale correct in her statement when she said that that smaller armed group arrived within days of the initial larger group of blockaders at Coutts, Alberta?
Yes.
After the seizure of this large cache of weapons, did you continue to be concerned for the safety of Canadians, Commissioner?
I'm always concerned about the safety of Canadians.
I understand. Did the cache of weapons increase your level of concern?
This whole protest raised my level of concern, and of course, past the seizure of those weapons, I was still greatly concerned because we always have a 1+1 rule. If there's one, there could be more.
Thank you. And do I understand correctly that there's an ongoing investigation into that particular matter?
Yes, the investigation continues and it's before the courts.
And if the investigation continues, is it not correct that it is premature to opine about the possible links between that extremist groups and any other group, including protesters and blockaders in Ottawa or elsewhere around the country?
Yes, and even if we had that information, I couldn't share that because it's still under investigation.
Thank you. And if I understand your earlier testimony correctly, Commissioner, prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, it was difficult for your team to identify these smaller extremist groups that were essentially using the larger blockades as cover. Is that correct?
Yes, we had no level of the certainty of who were involved with groups at all the protests because there's many groups that attach themselves to the cause and use that as cover for themselves.
But after the Emergencies Act was invoked, it became much clearer for law enforcement, did it not, in ensuring that the blockades in and of themselves were illegal activity? That helped you enforce the law, ensure that these extremist groups were removed, and thereby better protect Canadians.
Yeah, it helped us to reduce the footprint so we could go into an enforcement mode, maintain and reinforce the perimeter, restrict the travel in and out, and prevent children from coming in and secure that. So it gave us a lot of powers to work through that enforcement the safest way possible to protect the safety of Canadians and police officers.
And one last question. How important was removing the ability to access funds to ending the siege in Ottawa and preventing future blockades at our borders? Would police operations have been more difficult had those millions of dollars not been frozen? Commissioner?
Having those funds would have allowed people to stay much longer if they could continue to fuel their trucks, their stomachs, their families, of course. And so, when we look at things that were done in the Emergency Act, nationally, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police is actually looking at some of the things that were invoked, the authorities that were given in that Emergencies Act, to see if that's something that we should be looking at as future legislation.
Commissioner, thank you very much.
Going forward.
Mr. Green? Oh, pardon me. Monsieur Fortin.
Merci.
Mr. Fortin, thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Lucki, I was listening to your answers to Ms. Bandayan's questions. You confirmed that you found many weapons machetes and so forth. Is this the first time in your police career that you discover weapons like that on site?
No.
No, okay.
Okay. Ms. Lucki, I was listening to my colleagues' questions. Mr. Lamoureux, among others, was saying that in his province, Manitoba, the situation was very grave. But when I talked to you about the proclamation of emergency, I suppose you read it, right?
Yes.
Oui. Est-ce que vous
Did you read the annex that goes with this proclamation, which is presented to both chambers of Parliament under the Emergencies Act? Did you read that account, those minutes?
Yes, some time ago.
Oui, okay.
Yes, okay. In those minutes on page 5, it says that there was a consultation of First Ministers about the Emergencies Act. And I quoted, the Prime Minister called a meeting of First Ministers on February 14th to consult them about the proclamation of the Emergencies Act. When I read this account, it says that, indeed, Ontario supported the decision to proclaim. So did Newfoundland and Labrador and BC. But the other provinces and territory didn't quite. Manitoba, discussed by Mr. Lamoureux, it says the Premier of Manitoba said that the situation varied and that he was not convinced that this should be applied in Manitoba. She even says that it's not constructive to use this act in Manitoba because one has to be cautious in order to avoid unintended consequences. So, obviously, the Premier of Manitoba does not agree with my colleague, Mr. Lamoureux, or the Prime Minister of Canada. I don't want to spend my 5 minutes reading a text here, but Quebec said that, no, this would be divisive. We don't want it. Alberta said it opposed the invocation of the act. Saskatchewan said the police had enough tools to impose the act or the law, and it was not in favor of invoking this act. Manitoba, as I said, Nova Scotia, PEI, said it wasn't necessary. The 3 territories, Nunavut and so forth, did not comment. So, surely they didn't ask for it to be invoked. So, only 3 out of 13 premiers said it would be useful. So when I hear you say that you didn't ask for the proclamation of these emergency measures, apparently nobody did. The blockades outside of Ottawa were managed and dismantled without using the Emergencies Act. I just explained that 7 premiers didn't want it, 3 didn't say anything, and only 3 were in favor. And you're saying, in addition, that on February 12th, you had a plan to dismantle the blockades and put an end to protests on the Hill. On February 12th, you called for additional resources from across Canada that did arrive, and it worked. It took 3 or 4 days, and there was no more blockade or protest. When I look at all this, Ms. Lucki, in your opinion, was it justified to proclaim the Emergencies Act?
The plan that we put in place worked as a result of the Emergency Act measures.
No,
you told us that it was the 12th. It was on the 12th that you prepared the plan. You waited for the resources. When the resources arrived, you proceeded as anticipated. So the proclamation has nothing to do with that.
The enforcement plan wasn't put into place until approximately the 16th. It was after the pronouncement of the Emergency Measures Act, and that those measures assisted us in reducing the footprint so we could safely enforce. Otherwise,
Mais Madame Lucki, c'était le...
But Ms. Lucki, it was the plan of February 12th. You anticipated doing it. You said that on the 12th you didn't even know that it would be invoked on the 14th. So things are put in place. The premiers say that you are right, you could do it without the Emergencies Act. So where was the need to proclaim this? I really don't don't see it. With all due respect, Ms. Lucki, I know it's not you who proclaimed it, but you are the boss of the RCMP. I'd like to know how you justify this. Mr. Fortin?
Generous.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Vigneault, in an early report dated January 27th, ITAC concluded that a coordinated and complex terrorist attack or planned storming of Parliament or other federal locations is unlikely. However, in the same report, ITAC provided information to the government that talked about how that there was likely extremists were involved and the scale of the protest could pose a trigger point, an opportunity for the potential of lone actor attackers to conduct a terrorism attack. Is that correct? Mr. Vigneault?
Thank you very much.
Mr. Vigneault, is that correct?
Mr. Green, I have the executive director of ITAC, who is the author of that document, so I'm going to turn the floor to her. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, indeed, we did publish a report.
And that was back in January?
Yes, it was.
Okay, so is it your assessment, particularly given the investigations, I'm assuming this ITAC would have led or at least supported some of the investigative work at Coots, that there was a threat for terrorism given the discoveries at Coots?
What ITAC does, if I may just explain briefly.
I don't have time for that, unfortunately. I just need you to answer the question. Did you consider the preparations around Coots to be within the threshold of a threat of terrorism?
I cannot get into specifics of the classified information that was shared with us.
Well, I mean, clearly the government side leaked it. It was reported quite widely, in fact, in The Guardian. It was leaked. It said, we knew these people were coming. Right? That's from a federal government source.
I don't believe that the reports that you're referring to refer specifically to the events at Coots. Actually, it was earlier than that. Our assessment was about the opportunities that such a protest would afford to IMD elements.
But you were tracking them as they were on their way, correct? You had known. I mean, I think about this protest in particular, this movement, is that they were reporting on themselves through Zello, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and others. This is one of the most probably largest evidentiary sources of open source self-incrimination that I've ever seen. And so, when I look at this, and your report said that supporters of the convoy have advocated civil war, called for violence against the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and said that the protests should be used as Canada's January 6th. Is that correct? Is that accurate within the context of the report?
Yes, that's what the report mentioned.
Thank you. So I'm going to go back now to Mr. Vigneault. Mr. Vigneault, the government, pursuant to their legislation, has an explanation note. And in it has subsection 58. It talks about the Emergencies Act. And it uses language that is very similar to our definition, or legal definition, of terrorism. And so my question through you is, in your intelligence gathering, is it fair for you would you consider these processes within the threshold of terrorism or threats of terrorism?
So as I mentioned earlier, the Emergencies Act refers to the CSIS Act, but the information from CSIS is just one part of the information. We do not have the power to lay charges. So
I'm not asking that question, sir. Respectfully, Mr. Vigneault, you are a very intelligent man. I'm just asking you to answer the question that I've asked, sir.
Can you please repeat it?
Did it meet the threshold of terrorism? The definition in the explainer notes uses the definition of terrorism, but doesn't explicitly call it. So given that ITAC was on this, do you consider it to be within the threshold of a threat of terrorism?
I'm not sure, Mr. Green, that we can just make a comparison like that. Any element of terrorism needs to be looked at the facts that are in front of the police and then lay charges. The definition of terrorism to allow CSIS to investigate is very clear in the CSIS Act.
Then I'll put the question then to the Commissioner Lucki. Commissioner Lucki, you are not bound by the CSIS Act. Given that you would probably be briefed on the explanation note of the government invoking this act, would you believe it to be within the threshold of a threat of domestic terrorism?
At Coots, we did not lay terrorism charges.
That's not what I asked. Was it in the threat? And I'll be specific, that the threat or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property, including critical infrastructure, for the purpose of achieving a political or ideological objective within Canada. That is subsection I in the explainer notes of the proclamation. So is that within the threshold of a threat of terrorism?
We can't speak specifically to the threshold because that's not for me to decide if it meets a threshold.
You don't provide any information to ITAC on whether or not you believe there's a threat of terrorism? That's not part of your role in national security?
No, we provide the information, and then analysts take that information and put that all together. They can combine all that information, and they come up with an analysis of that information.
Mr. Green, apologies, Commissioner. Mr. Green, your time is up, and I've been generous.
I will take the chair and allow you to continue. Thank you so very much, Senator.
My question goes back to Mr. Duheme, and so I continue the same line of questioning. On the date or the weekend, and it's escaped me what day it was that you actually operationalized your plan here on Wellington Street and all other streets that were impacted by it. Can you tell me how many officers would have been available to you for deployment?
Madam Chair, I wouldn't have the exact number of officers on the streets and the shifts rotation. I could tell you as of February 17th, that's when activities started ramping up with our PLT, increased presence in the downtown core, and informing people of that this is an illegal protest and they must leave the area. I can tell you that the RCMP has provided in excess over 700 members to assist in this movement, but I don't have an overall number of people shift per shift.
And you can tell me how many police agencies were involved in that operation?
An exact number? No. Several from across the country Would
you be able to provide that information to us just to give us a sense of the scale of the operation itself?
I sure can.
And do you have any sense, or could you perhaps tell us of similar situation when you would have had that many people deployed in policing across Canada?
I think the only other situation that I could compare it with is major events that we usually manage.
So those would be things like the G8, the G20, some of those historical events. But there
Correct.
Would be
different in nature, but historical events like such would require a significant amount of resources.
So there was, from a planning perspective, in your incident command and your three key agencies that you referred to, and I understand the coordination table as a framework. Can you tell me what the time frame was from start to finish that team worked together?
So Ottawa Police Service, the RCMP and OPP have always been working together, but it's really on the February 12th when the ICC was created that it solidified, if you wish, the command structure as we move forward. OPS, as I mentioned, OPS always had the lead, and the OPP and RCMP were there, but this just solidified the command structure as we move forward in the preparation to the action to plan on the 17th.
And from the perspective of a reflection, the chance to look back as hot wash or whatever we want to call it, would there have been advantages to having that team in place much earlier from an operational perspective?
I would say yes, but yet I don't know all the elements that when OPS first started off with the convoy, I don't know all the elements that led us to the situation that we're in right now. But obviously, the sooner the better.
Yeah. So, and it would seem to me that the experience of other issues like your incident you referred to, there would be some advantage for early planning no matter what the incident is, and this may very well have been one of them.
Yes, Madam Chair, and I'll refer to the Commissioner's comment. When you look at the incidents that took place in Toronto and in Quebec City, they obviously learned from what took place here in Ottawa when it came to the convoy.
And isn't it also true that this would have been here in Ottawa and one of the most complex operations in terms of putting together the step-by-step process that needed to take place once you made a decision that you were moving people on, so to speak?
Complex in a sense, yes, and resource intensive because as we moved into that operational phase, there was no stopping. We had to continue. So that was a complexity. Is once we initiated the demobilization of each site, there's no stopping that momentum, if you wish.
And would it be fair also to say that in other incidents where you would have some experience in this, and you've had a lot of experience in it, I believe, this would not be cases necessarily that lasts as long as it does, that is as entrenched as it was, and has the amount of resources that required to actually mobilize over a single weekend. Am I correct on that?
Yep, you are correct.
Thank you.
Senator, the chair is now back to you.
Thank you. Senator Carignan.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for the Commissioner. You said that you found out on February 14th that the Emergencies Act would be proclaimed. And on the 15th, there was a decree on emergency economic measures, which provides for the seizure of bank accounts or all the economic activity of an individual. And it could be in life insurance, disability insurance, TFSAs, RSPs. Is it you, the RCMP, that asked for that power, that additional power, these additional measures from the government? No. There was the group of three, the RCMP, the Ottawa Police Service, and the OPP, in this integrated command center that was managing the crisis. Did one of these three request that power from the government?
I believe so.
Okay.
Okay. To follow up on the question we had earlier about communications with the banks, in the form, there was the possibility of communicating someone's legal record or criminal record. If there had been any kind of record, what was the relevance of giving this to a bank?
Sorry, we didn't provide criminal records. We simply provided the names of the people who were within the illegal blockade who were refusing to leave. So we followed up with license plates of vehicles that were there, drivers and owners of vehicles. And
Okay.
that information was provided to the banks.
Okay.
Okay. So when the superintendent, Denis Beaudoin, appeared before the Finance Committee on March 7, 2022, and said, and I quote, in the document, we could give the background with police, the fact that the person was suspected of having committed other crimes or witnesses of other crimes or any other type of background, end quote. That's inaccurate?
I will pass that to Mike Duheme because he dealt directly with that.
Madam Chair, Senator Carignan, yes, the information shared with the banks was information we had on file. Sometimes we only had a license plate. The information we have in various files is shared with the bank to make sure that they had the whole picture of the individual so that they could proceed with making the decision of freezing the accounts or not. Okay, and did that include antecedents vis-a-vis the police, that these people were suspected of having committed other crimes or were witnesses of other crimes or had any other kind of background of this nature? I'd have to check with Superintendent Beaudoin, but I think so. I think information was shared because the information we had to be improved to make sure it was the right person. So on what legal basis? I'm looking at this under the decree. How could you communicate that this person was suspected of having committed another crime other than simply being present at an illegal gathering? on Wellington Street. What was the legal basis for giving information other than that? Well, it's personal information that we transmitted to the bank to make sure that the bank or financial institution had the right picture and make the decision to freeze the accounts or not. Thank you.
Senator Harder. Senator White. He's after you. Do you want me to go to direct?
I yield to Senator White.
Senator White, the time is yielded to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Senator Harder. Deputy Commissioner Duheme, we heard a lot about funding that was frozen, that was being used to sponsor a criminal activity or being used to at least support criminal activity. Is that correct? In relation to Wellington Street specifically?
There was considerable funding that was aimed to support what was going on in downtown core of Ottawa.
Could no other tool have been used, like civil forfeiture under the province, to secure those funds and in an attempt to actually forfeit them to the Crown? Could that not have been used previous to the Emergencies Act? And if so, was it considered by the team that was working on developing a strategy?
So the lead role in with regards to the platform and the collection of funds was done by the OPP, excuse me, and I'm not quite sure if that was considered as they move forward on that.
But it was never discussed in any of the meetings you were in, using provincial civil forfeiture?
Not to my recollection.
Well, thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. On the 12th of February, were you confident that the police were at a point where their plan would be successful in removing and clearing, making whatever arrests necessary, the people that were situated on Wellington Street and beyond?
I was briefed of the plan on the 12th. I'm confident. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a plan that's in motion. It's dynamic. It's fluid because of what we're seeing on the terrain. But I'm confident. It might have tweaked a little bit as we move to the kinetic portion. But yes, I was confident.
But certainly you had no concerns, if I may. You had no concerns that you didn't have the resources, didn't have the capacity to actually operationalize the plan.
We didn't have the capability to operationalize the plan sooner, because as they were going through the plan, we noted that we needed additional special resources to address it.
But not something that you would need any other legislation to attain. You could access those resources through relationships.
We were planning with existing authorities that we had to demobilize.
Thank you very much. You spoke that there was a solidification of the command around February 12th. What caused the change and to that command to solidify on the 12th? Was it what happened on that day that would have caused it to be in a better position?
That's a good question, Senator White. We were in constant discussion with OPP as well as with OPS, and we came to a point that this would be a good practice. Not a good practice. It would be good if we got together and plan this, because initially, as I mentioned, prior to that date, there's ongoing discussions with OPS and OPP. We were always in the picture, but it was an OPS lead until it's always been an OPS lead.
Was it because there was a change in leadership for the OPS?
I don't want to assume that.
No, I'm asking it. I'm not assuming it either, actually. Do you believe that had an impact on solidifying the command and allowing the RCMP and the OPP to gain greater access to the command structure?
So I'm not sure if it was the timing that we're at that point, or it was a removal, or was the Mr. Slowly stepping down. So I'm not quite sure.
I may be able to add something to that.
Yes, please, if you don't mind. Thank you.
As they were requesting additional resources, and because we had to draw outside of the geographical area, we wanted to see what the plan was for the use of the resources so we could provide the right resources. And so we needed to see a solid plan going forward to make sure that we were providing the right resources. And that's when the ICC was formed to go through and have the planning cell create the plan and have the integrated command center review those plans.
Thank you very much for that, Commissioner. Deputy Duheme, one last question, if I may. Have you ever used or been involved in the use of aid to civil power?
No.
Have you ever seen it used?
No.
Had you had any discussions about the need for it in relation to the occupation in downtown Ottawa?
Not to my recollection, Senator.
So from your perspective, there wasn't a need to use aid to civil power, which would have given you more tools?
No.
Thank you very much, Deputy Commissioner. I appreciate your answers. I'm done, Madam Chair. I'm finished.
Thank you very much. It does complete our questions. I want to express our sincere appreciation to our witnesses for joining us this evening and answering questions to the best of your ability. We wish you a good evening, and thank you again.
And thank you for your respectful questions.
And
Thank you.
committee members, if we can just hang, it's my understanding that next week we had planned to have it as a business meeting.
Madam Chair?
Yes?
Sorry, I wanted to discuss the plan for next week. I think we were discussing getting both Minister Blair and having him present, and also discuss business, committee business. And based on Minister Blair's availability, he's available the first hour and a half of our committee meeting. So I was going to suggest if we can have him for first hour and a half, and the latter hour and a half we can discuss business, committee business.
I'm seeing
Madame
a
la
lot
Présidente, j'ai
Oui?
peut-être un point d'ordre.
I may have a point of order on this. That's not what was decided last week. Last week, can you hear me? Yes? Okay. What was discussed last week is that this week we would hear witnesses, but the same motion, I had insisted on that, as you will recall. The following week, we were supposed to take care of motions in suspense. So somebody said maybe we could hear witnesses for half the meeting, and I'd objected, and that's what we voted on. So the whole meeting should deal with motions that have been suspended and other business, but there's no witnesses. Otherwise, we'll end up in a situation where we'll lack time for questions that we have to settle, and especially urgent motions. And on the same opportunity, I'd like us to discuss the objections that the witnesses make. They're not acting in bad faith, far from it, but we get objections about the production of documents and parts of testimony. So we have to decide here at the committee what we do with this. Do we want to, you can hear me properly? Okay. So what do we want to do with this? Do we want to settle this one way or another? But we have to figure out these housekeeping matters before we continue to hear witnesses. That's what we decided last week, and with all due respect, Madam Chair, I insist that we maintain that decision, because my vote would have been different for today's meeting if we had not agreed that next week we would solely deal with motions that have been suspended. Thank you.
And Senator White.
My memory is not as good as Monsieur Fortin. Can you advise us what we did agree to for next week?
Can I ask the clerk to read the motion?
The motion was to have 3 hours of meetings today and to have committee business on the following meeting.
So no witnesses the following week?
That was not specified. It was just that there be committee business on the
Then I
following
support
meeting.
the Monsieur Fortin.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I think I was still on the speakers list.
Oh, pardon me. Go ahead.
Écoutez, moi, ça me...
Well, look, it suits me if that's the will of all members of the committee, but I'd like to point out that we certainly don't need 3 hours to go through the motions that have been circulated. I think that we could do everything in 1.5 hours and have the possibility, not having witnesses, but concluding our discussions on motions after an hour and a half, and then we just stop the meeting prematurely. I really don't understand, in other words. If Mr. Fortin prefers some other formulation where we would deal with motions first and have a witness after, I'd be open to that idea. Minister Blair is not available for the second part of our meeting, but perhaps other witnesses would be, and we could see whether time allows us to hear witnesses. But I find it very unfortunate that we conclude our discussion on motions within an hour and not have other work to do afterwards.
Naqvi, Mr. Green, and then Mr. Fortin. Mr. Naqvi?
Thank you very much. I just want to build on what my colleague, Ms. Medayan, is suggesting. One, I don't recall having a discussion where we talked about having the entire meeting doing committee business. I do agree that we need to attend to it. It was my understanding that we will spend half our time doing that, which should be appropriate in terms of the issues that we need to discuss. Furthermore, Minister Blair is available. He was an important part of the decision making around the Invocation of Emergencies Act. I think it's important that we hear from him. He's available 6:30 to 8 p.m. Next Tuesday. So it's an excellent opportunity for us to continue to do the good work that this committee is doing while listening to witnesses, to hear him, and then spend the latter part of the meeting working on committee business, which I'm sure will be sufficient time for us to resolve any issues that we have to as a committee.
Thank you. And, had I be coming to this fresh, I might tend to agree, but having sat through last session, I know that sometimes when we come at an impasse at committees over the will of committees, it's sometimes a tactic to filibuster or to use committee time in a way that would frustrate the outcomes of a particular vote. And I say that on top of the frustration that I have around the lack of information, candor, frankness that we've had from multiple witnesses that have been before us in this process. We keep hearing about cabinet confidentiality, and I want to put on the record our former General Legal Counsel, the House of Commons, Diane Davidson, who stated that the importance that there exists no blanket immunity for the executive branch in making public interest claims against the disclosure of confidential interest to a parliamentary committee. And for me, I'm getting to a point within this committee where it's almost beginning to feel like a breach of privilege or in some cases a contempt of this committee to get basic information that will be required to provide Canadians with the clarity, and future legislators, quite frankly, with the clarity that they need. It should be noted that our former General Legal Counsel noted that immunity has never been formally acknowledged in the House of Commons as inhibiting the investigatory powers, and that public interest is to be considered and weighed in judicial proceedings are not the same as the public interest to be considered and weighed when evidence is sought for parliamentary purposes. And so why I bring that up, Madam Chair, is because, at stake for our next round of committee business will likely be around our committee's power to compel and produce documents, which for me would provide the framework and the basis to ask informed questions against ministers. We don't have that currently. In fact, we've had no preliminary testimony aside from in my opinion, the evidence from Mr. Perrin-Beatty, and our legal clerks would set forth the framework for our work plan. But subsequent to that, I feel like we're being frustrated at every turn, and unnecessarily so.
So can I want to move to Mr. Fortin, but I just want to get to your bottom line.
My bottom line is that we're going to need 3 hours.
Okay.
Come at an impasse. We might find ourselves in a procedural filibuster.
Okay, thank you. I didn't mean to be rude,
Sorry, I didn't
Mr.
mean to throw
Green,
that.
but I'm worried about our
No,
time
I-
and our people on. Mr. Fortin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Indeed. I'm also concerned about the use of time. I say it often. I'd like our work to be finished before the end of June, the end of the session, but we can't do this in a botched way. We have to do this properly, and we have these things to settle. If it doesn't take 3 hours, fine. I'm convinced that every one of us will find something to do between 8 and 9 o'clock or between 9 and 10 o'clock. I'm not worried about that at all. But what I'd like to add, Madam Chair, to help us proceed more quickly next week is to make sure that within that 3-hour block we solve all this. And I'd suggest then that we ask our analysts to look through the testimony we've heard till now and list all the objections we got on the production of documents or questions so that we can work next week having a list, perhaps note the time and date, which witness objected to providing a document or answering a question, and then share that with all members of the committee, and then we arrive in committee next Tuesday, we'll know what we're talking about. That would be efficient.
Then Mr. Motz, and then we'll close with Senator Harder.
Thank you, Chair. I would agree with Mr. Fortin and Mr. Green. I think it behooves us to follow what we wanted to do from the very beginning, and that's develop a committee work plan. The analysts have had it available for us. We need to confirm it and follow, make it ours and move forward with it. We have a number of motions that are still on the table, not just one. We have a number of them that we need to deal with. And with respect to Mr. Nakvi, I'm confident that Mr. Blair is available more than 6:30 to 8 or 6:30 to 8 o'clock next Wednesday or next Tuesday only, between now and whenever we might choose to call him. So I'm sure he'll be available to us again down the road, and I certainly support 3 hours.
I'll be brief. I would have preferred to hear a witness and then get to business, but for the comedy of the committee, I'm quite happy to have 3 hours. I hope that we do more than just debate the outstanding motions, but actually have a discussion of the work plan going forward, so that we can give our staff some predictability of witnesses that we would like to see for the next number of weeks. I think we will have a significant debate and differences of view, which is fine, but let's state them once and get to a decision. I would second that.
Okay, so there seems to be some consensus around the table on having a 3-hour business meeting next week. Do you want a call vote on it, or are we satisfied? Okay. All right. I want to first, before we close, thank our interpreters who have stayed beyond 9:30 to assist us as well. And thank you all. And the meeting is now adjourned.